3 seconds. That's all he had before the engines reached full throttle and an $80 million jet carrying 14 people rolled onto the runway toward its own destruction. 3 seconds before Rowan Cross, a 32-year-old ground technician covered in grease stains and holding a crumpled inspection sheet, stepped directly into the path of that aircraft and threw up both hands. Nobody believed him. Nobody ever did. But somewhere deep inside those titanium engine casings, death was already counting down. If you want to know how one ordinary man uncovered a billion-dollar conspiracy hidden inside a machine that was never supposed to fail, stay until the very end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The hangar at Meridian Aviation's private terminal smelled the way it always did at 5:47 in the morning. Jet fuel, industrial solvent, and the particular metallic bitterness that came from turbine exhaust baked into concrete over decades. Rowan Cross had been breathing that smell for 11 years. It lived in his clothes, in the fabric of his truck seats, in the hair his daughter Lily complained about every morning when he dropped her at school. "Dad, you smell like an airplane again." "That's because I work on airplanes, Bug." "Can't you work on something that smells better?" He never had a good answer for that. Rowan arrived that morning 40 minutes before his shift technically started, the same way he arrived every morning. Not because anyone told him to, not because he was trying to impress a supervisor or earn overtime credit. He arrived early because the machines were quieter then, and quiet machines told you things that machines running at full capacity never would. He'd learned that from his father, who'd learned it from his, a line of men who understood engines the way some families understood music. Not as a skill exactly, but as a language that got passed down without anyone consciously teaching it. He poured himself coffee from the break room pot, which was always terrible and always exactly what he needed, and walked the floor. Meridian Aviation Services handled private charters, corporate jets, and the occasional celebrity transport out of a regional airport 40 minutes outside the city. It was not a glamorous operation. The hangar ceiling leaked in 2 places when it rained hard, the break room microwave had been broken for 7 months, and the company's idea of a holiday bonus was a gift card to a chain restaurant that had closed the previous spring. But the aircraft were real, and the work was serious, and Rowan had learned a long time ago that serious work done honestly was worth more than glamorous work done carelessly. That morning, Bay 3 held the aircraft he was already thinking about. Vivian Sterling's jet, a Gulfstream G700, tail number N4417VS, which the company's manifest listed as belonging to Sterling Aerospace Holdings, a name that meant absolutely nothing to Rowan, except that whoever owned it had enough money to spend $80 million on a machine that would spend most of its life sitting in a hangar waiting for its owner to need it. The aircraft had come in 10 days ago for its scheduled Type C inspection, which was the aviation equivalent of pulling an engine completely apart, examining every component under magnification, reassembling it with new seals and calibrated torques, and then certifying in writing that everything met specification. 3 separate teams had already done exactly that. Rowan wasn't on any of those teams. His job that morning was a simple pre-departure walk-around, the last set of eyes before the aircraft got cleared for departure, a formality more than anything else. A rubber stamp. He'd done hundreds of them. He started at the nose, the way he always did, working his way clockwise around the aircraft with a flashlight, even though the hangar lights were on, because shadows fell differently from different angles, and shadows were where problems lived. He checked landing gear, brake assemblies, hydraulic lines, control surfaces. He got to the starboard engine nacelle and crouched down slightly, running the flashlight beam along the lower cowling seam where access panels met the aircraft skin. He almost missed it. Almost. The light caught something on the concrete floor beneath the engine, a pattern of metallic particles, fine as ground pepper, scattered in a rough oval directly below the oil drain point. Rowan stopped moving. He crouched lower and looked at the pattern without touching it. The particles were bright, recent, and the shape of the scatter told him they hadn't dripped. They'd been expelled, pushed out under some kind of pressure or vibration. He stood up slowly and looked at his watch. Departure was scheduled for 6:30. It was currently 5:52. He pulled out his phone and took 6 photographs of the particles from different angles before he touched anything. Then he got a clean white cloth from his cart, pressed it carefully against the particles, and lifted it. The cloth came up with a faint metallic smear and something else, a dark, almost burnt quality to the residue that shouldn't have been there in oil drainage. Rowan stared at the cloth for a long moment. Then he walked to the landline phone mounted on the hangar wall and called dispatch. "This is Cross, Bay 3. I need to flag a departure hold on N4417VS. Engine anomaly, starboard side. I want the chief inspector down here before we clear this aircraft." The dispatcher's name was Fenton, and Fenton had been answering phones at Meridian for 9 years, which meant he had developed a very specific tone for situations like this. Not quite dismissive, not quite annoyed, but somewhere in the flat territory between the two. "Cross, that aircraft has 3 Type C sign-offs. It goes wheels up at 6:30. The client is already en route." "Then the client can wait," Rowan said. "I'm flagging a hold." There was a pause. "Chief Inspector Abrams already cleared this thing twice." "Then Chief Inspector Abrams can come explain what's on the floor under Bay 3's starboard engine." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll call him." Rowan hung up and went back to the engine. He didn't have authorization to open the nacelle himself. That required sign-off from a licensed A&P mechanic with the appropriate rating, which Rowan technically was, but which company policy required him to document through a chain of approvals before he touched anything on an aircraft someone else had already certified. So he stood there. He photographed the nacelle from every angle he could reach. He looked at the lower cowling seam and noticed, now that he was looking for it, that the panel fit wasn't quite right, a gap of maybe 0.5 millimeter more than it should have been, which could mean nothing, or could mean the panel had been removed and replaced in a hurry. He was still looking at that gap when he heard footsteps. 3 sets. Chief Inspector Gerald Abrams was a 54-year-old man who had been signing off aircraft at Meridian for 12 years and who carried himself with the particular confidence of someone whose competence had never seriously been challenged. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a gray mustache that he kept neatly trimmed and eyes that had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned to show nothing in professional disputes. Behind him came 2 members of the Type C inspection team, Davis and Kowalski, both of whom looked like they'd been woken up because they had. Behind all 3 of them, in a charcoal blazer over dark jeans, carrying a phone and a leather portfolio, and walking with the brisk, controlled energy of someone who had places to be and had factored in no room for complications, was a woman Rowan didn't recognize. She was tall, early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but probably wasn't. She had the kind of face that was difficult to read quickly. Composed, alert, the eyes taking everything in. She wore no jewelry except a single watch on her left wrist that Rowan recognized as the kind of watch that cost more than his truck. She walked into the hangar like she owned it, because she did. Vivian Sterling. Rowan knew the name from the tail number registration. He'd never seen the actual person before. Abrams reached him first. "Cross." He said the name the way you say a minor inconvenience. "What exactly are we looking at?" Rowan pointed at the floor. "Metallic particulate scatter under the starboard drain point. Fine, bright, recent. And the lower cowling panel on the starboard nacelle has a fit anomaly, Mom. Gaps too wide." Abrams crouched, looked at the floor for approximately 4 seconds. Normal seepage from the inspection process. "We had the drain open 3 days ago." "That residue isn't 3 days old," Rowan said, "and the particle composition doesn't match standard drain seepage. There's a burnt quality to it." "You pulled samples?" Rowan held up the cloth. Abrams looked at it. "That's contamination from the shop floor." "I pulled it directly from the scatter pattern. I documented it." Rowan held up his phone. 6 photographs before I touched anything." Abrams looked at the phone, looked at Rowan, and then looked past him at Vivian Sterling, who had stopped several feet away and was watching this exchange with an expression Rowan couldn't fully read. "Miss Sterling," Abrams said, his voice shifting into a smoother register. "I apologize for the delay. This is a pre-departure formality. My team has certified this aircraft through 3 separate inspection protocols. We will have you wheels up on schedule." "What's the concern?" Vivian said. Not to Abrams, to Rowan. Rowan looked at her directly. Most people in her position, in his experience, didn't look at ground technicians directly. They looked at the supervisors, at the people with titles after their names. She was looking at him. Metallic particles under the starboard engine, he said. Fine scatter pattern, expelled rather than dripped. Residue has thermal characteristics that don't match normal inspection drainage. The cowling panel fit is also off, slightly but consistently. What does that suggest to you? It suggests the engine should be opened before this aircraft moves. Vivian looked at Abrams. Can we open it? Abrams's jaw tightened slightly, the only indication of how much this annoyed him. Ms. Sterling, we have a board meeting in I know what we have, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the particular quality of a voice that was accustomed to ending conversations. Can we open the engine? Abrams looked at Davis and Kowalski. Neither of them said anything. It's unnecessary. This is going to cost us at minimum 2 hours, and the inspection will confirm what we already know, that the aircraft is airworthy. Then we'll know that for certain, Vivian said. Open it. The nacelle came off in 22 minutes. Rowan didn't touch the engine himself. He stood back and let Davis and Kowalski work, watching, because watching was what he'd come here to do. Abrams stood with his arms crossed. Vivian stood nearby with her phone down, which Rowan noticed, because most executives kept their phones up. She was paying attention. The engine was a Rolls-Royce Pearl 700, 41,000 pounds of thrust, a machine precise enough that its tolerances were measured in microns. When the nacelle panels came away and the inspection lights went on, everything looked clean, the kind of clean that came from a recent professional service. Rowan moved closer to the oil system. Can I look at the oil return line? He said. Abrams made a gesture that wasn't quite permission and wasn't quite refusal, which Rowan took as permission. He crouched next to the engine with his flashlight and looked at the oil return tube assembly. From the outside, it looked fine. Correct fittings, correct routing, no visible damage to the insulation. He looked at the tube itself, specifically at the section closest to the high-temperature zone near the combustion casing. Do you have a bore scope? He said to Kowalski. Kowalski looked at Abrams. Abrams, after a moment, nodded. The bore scope was a flexible fiber optic camera, the diameter of a pencil that could be threaded into places human eyes couldn't reach. Kowalski threaded it into the access port near the oil return assembly and handed Rowan the display screen. Rowan looked at what the camera showed him. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said quietly, "There it is." "What?" Abrams moved closer. The oil return tube. Interior wall. Rowan tilted the screen so Abrams could see. See that ovalization? The tube wall is deforming, not much, maybe 8% from spec, but under operating temperature that tube will collapse. When it collapses, oil flow to the main bearing drops. Bearing runs dry. At cruise power, you're looking at catastrophic failure inside 20 minutes. The hangar was very quiet. Davis leaned in to look at the screen. Kowalski had gone still. That tube passed visual inspection, Abrams said. His voice was different now. The smoothness gone, something tighter underneath. Because it looks fine at ambient temperature, Rowan said. It's a thermal deformation failure mode. You can't see it without a bore scope, and even with one you have to know what you're looking for. He straightened up. The material is wrong. The wall thickness is within spec visually, but the alloy composition is different. This tube is an OEM. What are you saying? Vivian said. She had moved closer without Rowan noticing, and she was looking at the screen. I'm saying this is a counterfeit part, Rowan said. It was made to look correct. It passes every visual check, but the alloy can't handle sustained thermal cycling, and at operating temperature, it fails. Vivian looked at the screen, then at Rowan, then at Abrams. Abrams' face had gone very still. Pull the tube, Vivian said. Ms. Sterling, I would recommend we have a qualified pull the tube. Must. The tube came out in 6 minutes. Kowalski held it under the inspection light. Even without analysis equipment, you could see it if you knew what you were looking at. The color of the alloy was a fraction of a shade off, the surface finish slightly too uniform, the stamp marking slightly too crisp. Not wrong enough to catch in a casual inspection. Wrong enough to matter. Abrams looked at the tube for a long time. Then he looked at Rowan with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not quite anger, not quite something else. We'll need to do a full materials analysis, he said. His voice was professionally flat. "This will take time." "How long?" Vivian said. "Minimum 6 hours for rush analysis, possibly 12. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she took out her phone and made a call. "Marcus, the board meeting is postponed." "Yes, postponed, not canceled." A pause. "Because I'm standing next to an engine that nearly killed 14 people. That's why." She hung up. She turned to Rowan. "What's your name?" "Cross. Rowan Cross." "How did you know?" she said. 3 inspection teams went through this aircraft. What did you see that they didn't?" Rowan thought about how to answer that honestly without it sounding like he was criticizing professional inspectors who had more certifications than him. "I didn't know," he said. "I saw something that shouldn't have been there, and I didn't have a reason to explain it away, so I didn't." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "That's a more honest answer than I expected. I'm not really built for other kinds." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed, forward-looking focus of someone already calculating next steps. "I want this aircraft grounded until we have full materials analysis on every non-OEM component. I want a list of every part that went into this inspection, and I want to know who authorized the purchase orders." She said this last part to Abrams, and the way she said it made the temperature in the hangar feel like it dropped several degrees. Abrams said he'd pull the records. He left with Davis to do that, and Kowalski stayed with the engine, and Rowan found himself standing alone near the aircraft with Vivian Sterling, who looked at the open nacelle with an expression that was impossible to read. "Have you worked here long?" she said, without looking at him. 11 years? That long. She said it like she was calculating something. "You have a specialty?" Rowan hesitated. "Turbine diagnostics, used to." He didn't elaborate. She turned and looked at him directly. "Used to. People's situations change." She let that lie there for a moment, seemed to decide she wasn't going to push it, and looked back at the engine. "I want to be very clear about something, Mr. Cross. What you just did, stopping this departure, pushing through 3 layers of authority to get someone to listen, that was not a small thing. Do you understand what would have happened if this aircraft had departed?" Rowan understood exactly. He'd run the numbers in his head the moment he'd seen the borescope image. At cruise altitude, at cruise power, with that tube geometry, the oil starvation timeline was 22 minutes or so before the main bearing began to seize. 14 people on the manifest. No engine failure this catastrophic at cruise altitude ended well. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "I need people around me who understand what they're looking at." She walked away to take another call, and Rowan looked at the engine for a moment, and then he went back to his cart and wrote up his incident report in full, because paperwork was the thing that made truth permanent, and he'd learned a long time ago that truth needed to be made permanent before people had time to rearrange it. He was halfway through the report when his shift supervisor, a man named Garrett Hale, appeared at his elbow with the specific expression of a man delivering unwelcome news. "Good catch this morning," Hale said. He didn't say it warmly. He said it the way you said something you were required to say. "Thanks. Management wants to talk to you." "I figured. They also want to audit your parts intake records from the last 60 days. Rowan looked up from his paperwork. "My parts intake records." "Yeah." Hale didn't meet his eyes. "It's routine, given the situation." Rowan set down his pen. He looked at Hale for a moment, reading the man's body language the way he read engine anomalies, calm, looking for the thing that wasn't quite right, the indicator that pointed toward something underneath. Hale was uncomfortable. Not the normal discomfort of a supervisor delivering annoying news, something tighter. "Sure," Rowan said, "whatever they need." He finished his incident report, signed it, and submitted it through the digital system at 8:14 a.m. By 9:30, his digital access badge had been suspended pending investigation. By 11 o'clock, the security department was showing him surveillance footage of himself accepting a parts delivery 6 weeks ago. A delivery that included, according to the manifest now being cross-referenced, components from a supplier Meridian had no authorized contract with. A supplier whose components, according to the emerging investigation, were counterfeit. The footage was real. He recognized himself in it. He had accepted that delivery. He had accepted it because the paperwork had been perfect, the supplier code had matched the system, and he'd had no reason whatsoever to think anything was wrong. But watching the footage with two internal security investigators in a windowless room on the third floor of the Meridian Administrative Building, he understood with cold clarity that the paperwork being perfect was exactly the point. Someone had set this up very carefully. "Mr. Cross," said the senior investigator, a man named Prescott with careful, neutral eyes, "the counterfeit components found in aircraft N4417VS can be traced through the chain of custody to a delivery you personally received on the 14th of last month. The supplier code on the delivery manifest matches a vendor ID that was apparently created without proper authorization. Can you explain how you came to accept parts from an unauthorized vendor?" "Because the system showed it as authorized," Rowan said. "The system shows the vendor ID was created 2 days before that delivery." "Then someone created it in the system. Someone with system access." "I don't have vendor creation access. My clearance level is receiving an inventory. Any technician-level employee can look that up." Prescott wrote something down. "Mr. Cross, are you aware of any financial relationship between yourself and any parts supplier, authorized or otherwise?" Rowan looked at him steadily. "No." "Are you aware that a payment of $4,200 was made to a bank account registered in your name from a company called Vortex Component Supply approximately 8 weeks ago?" The room was very quiet. Rowan kept his expression still because going reactive in a room like this, with people like this, accomplished nothing. But the number landed in his chest with a specific cold weight. $4,200. He'd received no such payment. He had no account with that bank. But he already knew, with a clarity that came from years of diagnosing systems, what it meant that someone had made sure such a payment existed. "I'm not aware of that payment," he said, "because I didn't receive it. The account is registered to your home address." "Then someone opened an account in my name." Prescott looked at him in the way investigators looked at you when they were deciding whether you were lying convincingly or telling the truth. "Mr. Cross, I have to inform you that pending the outcome of this investigation, your employment is suspended with pay. You are asked not to enter company facilities or contact company personnel." Rowan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Can I get copies of the surveillance footage, the delivery manifest, the payment records? Those are part of an active internal investigation. I'm asking for records that directly concern me. Our legal department will be in contact regarding your rights in this matter." He drove home at 12:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, which meant he was the only car in his neighborhood parking, which was quiet and looked wrong in the way that the middle of any weekday looked wrong when you were supposed to be at work. He sat in his truck for a few minutes before going inside. The house was a 3-bedroom ranch style on a street of similar houses, all of them decent and none of them remarkable. He'd bought it 4 years ago after his wife Maya died, because the apartment they'd been renting was full of her everywhere, and full of her everywhere had eventually become something he couldn't breathe through. The house was supposed to be fresh. It had become home without him exactly deciding for it to. Lily's drawings were on the refrigerator. She was 7 and currently going through a phase where everything she drew had horses in it, regardless of what it was supposed to be. Her drawings from school, from her art class, from bored Sunday afternoons, all of them featured at least one horse, often in situations where horses had no business being. He'd asked her once why the horse was in the picture of their house. "Because he lives there too," she'd said, like this was obvious. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the refrigerator. Then he sat down at the table with his phone and started writing down everything he remembered about the delivery on the 14th of last month. The time, the driver, the truck, the paperwork, the sequence of events, every detail he could recall before memory started doing what memory did, and filling in blanks with what seemed probable rather than what was certain. He wrote for an hour and 40 minutes. Then he picked Lily up from school at 3:15, which he never did on a Tuesday, and she looked at him with the particular suspicion of a 7-year-old who knew something was different. "Why are you here?" she said. "I had the afternoon off." "Did you get in trouble?" "What makes you ask that?" "You have your trouble face." He didn't know he had a trouble face. He made a note to be more careful about that. "I had a complicated morning," he said. You want to go get ice cream? It's cold. Ice cream is not a temperature-dependent food. She considered this seriously. Okay, she said, but I want the one with the sprinkles. He got her the one with the sprinkles. He got himself black coffee. They sat in the ice cream place that smelled like sugar and cold air, and Lily told him about her day with the particular narrative chaos of a 7-year-old storytelling, non-linear, detail-rich in the wrong places, containing at least 3 subplots that didn't resolve. He listened to all of it. This was the part of his day that didn't require him to be capable or competent or right. This was the part of his day that just required him to be present, and presence, he'd learned in the years since Maya, was the one thing he could always manage if he didn't let everything else crowd it out. They got home at 4:45. He made pasta for dinner because pasta was the one thing he could make reliably. Lily ate it with the specific enthusiasm of a child who would never in her life be a food critic, which he found deeply refreshing. They watched 40 minutes of a cartoon about horses, naturally, before her bedtime routine, which was elaborate and non-negotiable and involved exactly 2 stories, a specific arrangement of stuffed animals, and a glass of water that he had to bring in the specific blue cup. Not the green one, because the green one tasted different, she said, and he had never been able to figure out if she was right. He sat on the edge of her bed after the second story, in the low light of her nightlight, and she looked up at him with her mother's eyes, that particular dark brown that went very still when it was paying attention. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah, Bug." "Did you fix the airplane?" He looked at her. He hadn't told her anything. "How do you know about that?" "Mrs. Patterson's dad works at the airport," she said. "She said a mechanic stopped a plane from breaking. Was that you?" He thought about the right answer to that, not the complicated answer. She was 7. The right answer for a 7-year-old who was looking at him in the dark with her mother's eyes. "Yeah," he said. "That was me." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you had your trouble face?" "Doing the right thing and having an easy time are 2 different things," he said. She turned that over in her mind the way she turned things over, thoroughly, at her own pace. "But you still did it." "Yeah, I still did it." "Good," she said, with the absolute certainty of someone for whom the moral calculation was straightforward, and pulled her blanket up and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. Rowan sat there a little longer than he needed to. Then he went back to the kitchen table and opened his laptop and started researching Vortex component supply, because whatever had happened today, the particles on the floor, the counterfeit tube, the footage, the bank account he'd never opened, none of it was random. None of it was coincidence. He'd worked with machines long enough to know that when multiple systems failed in the same direction at the same time, it was never bad luck. It was design. He found Vortex Component Supply's business registration in 3 minutes, incorporated 14 months ago. Listed address was a mail forwarding service in a business district 2 states away. No website, no listed principals. The company existed on paper and nowhere else, which meant someone had built it specifically to exist on paper and nowhere else. He found the authorization for the supplier ID in Meridian's public procurement registry, a document he could access because Meridian posted its vendor approvals publicly as part of its aviation safety compliance disclosure. The vendor ID had been created by someone with system administrator access. The authorization was signed by a person whose name Rowan didn't recognize, D. Calloway, Director of Supply Chain Operations. He wrote the name down. He looked up the Meridian organizational chart on the company's website. There was no D. Calloway listed, which meant D. Calloway either didn't exist or existed at a level the public org chart didn't show, or the name was false. He sat back and looked at what he had. A counterfeit part that would have brought down an $80 million aircraft. A ghost company. A ghost authorization. Surveillance footage of him accepting the delivery. A bank account in his name he'd never opened. His access suspended. His employment suspended. Someone had been very careful. Someone had been very patient. And someone had, at some point in the past 14 months, decided that if this ever started unraveling, Rowan Cross, unremarkable, single father, 11-year employee, was the person who was going to take the fall for it. He closed his laptop at 11:45 p.m. He checked on Lily. Still asleep, Blanket half kicked off the way it always was by midnight, one stuffed horse tucked under her arm. He straightened the blanket without waking her. Then he went to his own room and lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. He wasn't angry, exactly. He'd moved through anger quickly because anger was loud and loud things obscured detail. What he felt now was something quieter and more focused. The particular clarity that came from understanding a system well enough to know you were inside it, that the things surrounding you had a structure, and that structures, no matter how carefully built, always had the same weakness. They were built by people, and people always made mistakes. He thought about Vivian Sterling standing in the hangar, looking at the bore scope image, saying, "Pull the tube," in a voice that didn't need to be loud to be final. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not at his supervisor, not at the chief inspector, but at him, and asked him directly what he saw. She'd believed him fast. Faster than anyone in that building should have, given who he was and who she was, and what 3 certified inspection teams had already told her. He thought about why that was. He thought about it for a long time before he fell asleep, and the answer he arrived at, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, was this. She hadn't believed him because of his credentials, or his title, or his authority. She'd believed him because he'd been specific, because he'd photographed the evidence before he touched it, because he'd been able to explain exactly what he was seeing and why it mattered, because he'd shown his work. Whatever came next, that was going to be how he survived it. Not connections, not authority, not someone deciding to take his side out of goodness. Evidence. Documentation. The specific, verifiable, physical truth of what had happened laid out clearly enough that it couldn't be argued away. He was good at that. He'd been good at it for 11 years, in a hangar that smelled like jet fuel and industrial solvent, diagnosing machines that couldn't speak, but had a great deal to say if you knew how to listen. Whatever they'd built around him, the ghost company, the false account, the footage, the whole careful architecture of his guilt, they'd built it to fool people who worked from assumption and authority. They hadn't built it to survive someone who worked from evidence. Outside, the airport was lit against the dark sky, its light steady and orange and indifferent, and somewhere in Hangar 3, a Gulfstream G700 sat with its starboard engine open and its counterfeit oil return tube on a workbench, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. Rowan Cross was already working on it. The name D. Calloway turned out to be a dead end in the most deliberate way possible, which was itself information. Rowan had spent the better part of Wednesday morning working backward through every public document he could access related to Meridian's vendor authorization system. The company's aviation safety compliance disclosures were publicly filed because federal regulation required them to be, and those disclosures included quarterly vendor approval logs, which meant anyone with enough patience and enough coffee could sit at a kitchen table and cross-reference supplier IDs against authorization signatures. Rowan had both patience and coffee, and by 10 in the morning he had a list of 7 vendor approvals signed by D. Calloway over a 14-month period. 7 approvals, 7 different supplier companies, all of them incorporated within the 18 months prior, all of them with registered addresses at mail forwarding services in different states. 7 ghost companies, 14 months of purchases, and a name that didn't appear anywhere in Meridian's public organizational structure. He wrote all of it down in a legal pad he'd bought at the drugstore the previous evening because he didn't trust his laptop to be the only place this information existed. He dated each page, noted his sources, and kept his handwriting slow and deliberate. It was the same discipline he applied to maintenance documentation. The understanding that a record was only as good as the precision of the person making it. His phone rang at 10:23. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then he did, because unknown numbers were either spam or something he needed to know about, and right now he couldn't afford to not know things. Mr. Cross? The voice was female, controlled, slightly clipped, the voice of someone who was accustomed to making calls she hadn't entirely decided to make yet. This is Vivian Sterling. Rowan set down his pen. Ms. Sterling, I got your number from your employee file. I'm aware that's irregular. A beat. I'm also aware that you were suspended yesterday afternoon pending an internal investigation connecting you to the counterfeit components found on my aircraft. That's correct. Did you do it? The directness of it caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was rude, but because it wasn't the question he'd expected. He'd expected something procedural, something legal, department-mediated, and careful. Not that. "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because I had no reason to and no mechanism to. I don't have vendor creation access. I don't have supply chain authorization. Whatever records they're showing you, someone built them to point at me." Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to believe him. Something more calculating than that. "The payment to your account," she said. "The $4,200. I've never had an account at that bank. I don't know who opened it or how, but it wasn't me." That's a very specific thing to be certain about. "I know what bank accounts I have," he said. "I have two. A checking account at Harrow Federal Credit Union, where my direct deposit goes, and a savings account at the same institution where I keep Lily's college fund. That's it. Whoever opened the Vortex account used my name and my address. They didn't use me." Another silence, longer. "Who's Lily?" "My daughter." Something shifted in the quality of the silence. "How old?" "7. "Okay," Vivian said, and her voice had changed register slightly, in a way he couldn't fully characterize. "I'm going to tell you something that hasn't been released publicly yet. The materials analysis on the oil return tube came back this morning. The alloy composition is consistent with a batch of counterfeit aerospace components that the FAA flagged in a separate investigation 14 months ago. Components traced to a manufacturing operation in a country that shall remain nameless for legal reasons. The FAA investigation stalled because the supply chain documentation was too well constructed to follow. The components went into the market and disappeared. Rowan absorbed this. Until now, which means what's in my aircraft isn't an isolated incident. It's the tail end of something larger." She paused. "I have 47 aircraft in my company's fleet, Mr. Cross. 47 aircraft that went through the same inspection protocols, sourced from the same supply chain, over the same 14-month period." The number sat in the air between them. "You need to ground them," Rowan said. "I'm aware of that. I'm also aware that grounding 47 aircraft simultaneously would cost my company approximately $12 million a day in operational disruption, and would require me to justify that decision to a board that is already under significant pressure from a shareholder group that wants me to sell the company's technology division." She said this without self-pity, simply laying out the topography of her situation the way you laid out the factors in a complex diagnosis. "My chief operating officer called me this morning and told me very politely that the incident with N4417VS had been resolved, that the affected components had been identified and isolated, and that there was no need for fleet-wide action." "Who told him that?" "He didn't specify." "Did you ask?" A short pause. "No, I should have." The way she said it had a self-correcting quality, a willingness to note her own misstep that Rowan found unusual in someone with her level of authority. Most people at her altitude had spent years learning to externalize error. "I want to meet with you, not at Meridian facilities, somewhere neutral." Rowan looked around his kitchen, at the legal pad, at the list of 7 ghost companies and 14 months of D. Calloway's signature. "When?" "This afternoon. There's a coffee place called Hanratty's on the corner of 6th and Marcellus. Do you know it?" "I can find it." 2 o'clock. Come alone and don't tell anyone at Meridian you're meeting me." She paused. "I realize that instruction sounds somewhat dramatic. It sounds like someone who understands that they might have a problem inside their organization," Rowan said. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it sounds like." She hung up, and Rowan sat for a moment looking at the phone. Then he went back to his legal pad and added a note at the top of the first page, underlined, "Fleet-wide, 47 aircraft, 14 months." He thought about the scope of that. 47 aircraft serviced through the same compromised supply chain. If the oil return tube failure mode was consistent, thermal deformation under sustained operating temperature, undetectable by standard visual inspection, then every aircraft that had received any oil system component from Vortex or its associated ghost companies in the last 14 months was carrying a time bomb measured in flight hours. The math on that was not something he let himself dwell on too long. He showered, put on a clean shirt, and drove to Hanratty's. The place turned out to be the kind of coffee shop that had been a neighborhood institution for 30 years and looked it. Scuffed wood floors, mismatched chairs, a menu on a chalkboard that hadn't changed since probably 2003. Vivian Sterling was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall in the instinctive way of someone who'd learned to see a room before being seen in it. She was dressed differently than she'd been in the hangar. Less formal, dark jacket over a gray shirt, hair down. She looked less like a CEO and more like a person, which Rowan suspected was at least partly deliberate. She had 2 coffees waiting. He sat down across from her. "You ordered for me." "Black," she said. "I guessed." He looked at the cup. She'd guessed right. He decided not to make anything of that and picked up the cup. "I've been making some calls this morning," Vivian said. She had both hands around her own cup, and she was looking at him with that direct, assessing quality he'd noticed in the hangar. Quietly. "People I trust, which is a shorter list than it used to be." She paused. "The shareholder group that's been pressuring me to sell the technology division. They've been pushing for 18 months. That's the same time frame as the D. Callaway vendor authorizations." "I noticed that," Rowan said. "You found the Callaway signatures." "Public compliance filings, 7 approvals, 14 months, all ghost companies with mail forwarding addresses." She studied him for a moment. "You did that overnight." "I had time." Most people who got suspended and framed for something they didn't do would spend that time calling a lawyer. "I called a lawyer," he said, "at 8 this morning. She's looking at the bank account situation. But I also know how to read a supply chain document, and I had access to the filings, and sitting around waiting for someone else to do the work that I could do seemed like a bad use of the next 24 hours. Vivian was quiet for a moment in the way she sometimes went quiet. Not uncomfortable silence, but the silence of someone whose mind was running fast behind a still face. "Callaway doesn't exist in any company record I can access," she said. "I checked this morning through our HR system, our payroll system, and our directory. No D. Callaway, no Callaway of any first initial, current, or former. Then the signature is fabricated, or it's a pseudonym with system access somehow attached to it. System administrator access to vendor creation requires dual authorization, someone's own credentials plus a supervisor cosign." She wrapped both hands tighter around her cup. "Which means at least 2 people in my organization's IT or supply chain structure are involved in this." The word "involved" hung between them. It was a careful word, the word of someone who had been trained by years of corporate communication to not say corrupt or criminal in an informal setting before the evidence fully supported it. Rowan respected the precision even if he already knew what the evidence was pointing at. "Tell me about the shareholder group," he said. She looked at him for a moment, as if deciding how much of this was appropriate to share with a suspended maintenance technician she'd met the previous morning. Then she seemed to make a decision and moved forward with it. "Hargrove Capital Partners, 8% stake in Sterling Aerospace Holdings. They've been pushing for a sale of our avionics division, what we call the technology division internally, for 18 months. The division holds 32 patents on sensor integration systems used in commercial and military guidance applications. The patents alone are valued at somewhere between $1.2 and $1.8 billion, depending on the valuation methodology. And Hargrove's offer? Currently standing at $620 million. Rowan did the arithmetic. That's less than half of floor valuation. Yes. And they've been applying what kind of pressure to get you to accept that? Vivian's jaw tightened slightly. Operational disruption. 2 supplier contract failures in the last year that we later traced to interference with our vendor relationships. Nothing we could prove, just enough damage to make the quarter numbers look bad. A proxy vote push that failed by a narrow margin. And now, she looked at him steadily. A fleet of aircraft with compromised components and a narrative ready to go that attributes it all to a negligent maintenance worker who was accepting bribes from counterfeit suppliers. The weight of that laid itself out very clearly. They were going to use the crash, Rowan said. Vivian didn't look away. If N4417VS had gone down, yes. I believe they intended to use the investigation, the liability, the reputational damage, and the regulatory scrutiny to force the board to accept the sale at their terms. 18 months of preparation. A complete counterfeit supply chain infiltration. Documentation pointing to a single low-level employee who couldn't defend himself. She paused. And it nearly worked. Rowan thought about that. About how close it had been. About the metallic particles on the hangar floor at 5:52 in the morning, and the 4 seconds he'd almost kept walking. There's something else, he said. She waited. The Callaway authorization spanned 14 months. That's not one batch of components. If they were placing counterfeit parts across your fleet systematically through multiple ghost vendors over that kind of time frame, it's not just the oil return tubes. That's a pattern of substitution. They would have spread it across different component categories to avoid detection clustering. Vivian set her cup down. Meaning what exactly? Meaning, if I were doing this, if I were building a sabotage supply chain designed to look like negligence and operational decay rather than deliberate interference, I wouldn't concentrate on one failure mode. I'd spread the counterfeit substitutions across multiple systems, multiple aircraft, with different thermal or fatigue timelines. Some would fail early. Some would fail months from now. The pattern would look like poor maintenance culture rather than targeted sabotage. The color in her face had shifted slightly. Not panic. She didn't seem like someone who panicked, but something tighter and more focused, the look of someone recalibrating the scale of what they were dealing with. So the oil return tube isn't necessarily the worst thing in my fleet. It's the thing we found. It's probably not the only thing. She was quiet for a long moment. Around them, Hanratty's murmured with its usual midday sounds, the espresso machine, a conversation about someone's renovation project at the table by the window, the specific acoustic softness of a room full of wood and fabric and human presence, normal life going about itself, unconcerned. I need your help, Vivian said. It was a direct statement, no hedging, no business-speak scaffolding around it. He noted that about her. She didn't dress requests up in language that made them sound less like requests. It was either a cultivated habit or a natural one, and he wasn't sure it mattered which. I'm suspended, he said, and I'm under investigation. I know. I'm also the person who can resolve both of those things. Can you? I'm still the CEO of this company, she said. That counts for something, even if it's been counting for less lately. Something moved across her face. Not quite bitterness, but the adjacent territory. I need someone who understands these engines well enough to tell me what else might be in them. Someone who isn't connected to the supply chain team, isn't connected to the inspection teams, and doesn't have any reason to protect whoever built this system. And you want that to be me. You're the one who found it, she said simply. Rowan looked at his coffee. He thought about his lawyer who had told him this morning to stay quiet, stay home, and let the legal process work. He thought about the legal process working on a timeline measured in weeks while 47 aircraft sat in hangars across the country with unknown components from unknown suppliers running through their systems. He thought about 14 people on a manifest. If I help you, he said, I need access to the full purchasing records for every inspection cycle in the last 18 months, every component, every supplier, every authorization, not the sanitized compliance filing version, the internal system records. I can get you that. I also need the bore scope and the materials testing equipment, and I need someone who can run lab analysis without it going through your standard supply chain department. I have a contact at the university's materials engineering lab. Independent, no connection to the company. Okay, he looked at her. This is going to take more than a few days. I know. And whoever built this is still inside your organization, which means they're going to know something is happening. Yes. Which creates a problem. I'm aware of the problem, she said. I don't have a clean solution to it yet. I'm working on it. He almost said something about the risk of that, about walking back into a situation where the people who had framed him still had system access and administrative authority. Then he thought about the alternative, which was sitting at his kitchen table with a legal pad while this thing either got buried or got worse. And he realized the alternative wasn't actually acceptable to him in any practical sense. All right, he said. She nodded. Not with relief exactly, more with the focused quality of someone crossing an item off a mental list and moving immediately to the next one. There's something else you need to know, something I didn't tell you on the phone. She looked at him steadily. Yesterday afternoon, after the inspection hold, I had a conversation with my COO, a man named Elliot Marsh. He told me the situation was contained, the affected components had been isolated, and I should proceed with the board meeting rescheduled for Friday. She paused. He also said, very carefully, the way people say things they want you to hear without being able to quote them later, that the investigation into the parts intake anomaly had identified a clear point of responsibility and that Meridian's legal team was confident they could resolve the situation quickly and quietly. Quickly and quietly meaning me, Rowan said. Yes. And Marsh knew who I was at that point. He said your name. Rowan thought about Garrett Hale's face the previous morning, the discomfort, the avoidance of eye contact, the slightly too rehearsed delivery of the bad news. Hale wasn't a sophisticated operator. Hale was a shift supervisor who had probably been told what to do and had done it because refusing would have required a courage he didn't have. But Marsh was different. Marsh was the kind of person who chose words like a surgeon chose instruments. What do you know about Marsh? Rowan said. He's been COO for 3 years. He came in during a period when the board was pushing for operational efficiency measures, which means he came in specifically to cut costs and streamline processes. He has relationships with most of the major supply chain vendors we use. She paused. And 6 months ago, he joined the advisory board of a private equity firm, one that, as it turns out, has financial ties to Hargrove Capital Partners. Rowan looked at her. I found that this morning, she said. It's not in any document he was required to disclose to Sterling Aerospace. Private advisory board positions, under a certain income threshold, don't require disclosure under his employment contract. But you found it. I have people I trust, she said. Not many, but some. Rowan sat with this for a moment, turning it over. Marsh with his relationships to the supply chain vendors, his operational authority over the inspection programs, his ties, indirect but traceable, to the group that wanted to force the technology division sale. A man in exactly the right position to authorize ghost vendors, manage the documentation, and point the eventual investigation at someone beneath him on the org chart. If it's Marsh, Rowan said, he's not working alone. He needs someone inside IT to create and maintain the Callaway credentials. He needs someone in the inspection teams who knows where not to look. And he needs someone who understands aviation components well enough to select substitutions that will fail in a specific way on a specific timeline. Vivian nodded slowly. A conspiracy requires more than one person. It always does. He looked at her. The person who selected those counterfeit components knows turbine systems. They didn't just pick random parts. The oil return tube failure mode is very specific. Thermal deformation that passes visual inspection fails under sustained operating temperature. That's not a lucky guess. That's someone who understands engine thermodynamics. Which rules out Marsh. Marsh is the administrator. He's not the engineer. Rowan paused. Who in your organization has both turbine knowledge and supply chain access? Vivian thought about this for a moment. Then her expression changed, a slight shift, barely perceptible, but Rowan was watching for it. There's one person, she said slowly, head of our technical procurement division, man named Curtis Boyle. He spent 12 years as a turbine engineer before he moved into procurement management. He has full system access, he sits on the supply chain authorization committee, and she stopped. He what? He was the one who co-signed 2 of the Callaway authorizations, she said. I checked this morning. 2 of the 7 Callaway approvals had a co-signature. I didn't recognize the co-signer's name. It was a systems admin credential, abbreviated. But Boyle's employee ID is the last 4 digits of that credential sequence. The pieces settled into place with the particular quiet clarity of a diagnostic that had finally produced a reading. Marsh sets the strategy, authorizes the money flow, manages the board relationship, Rowan said. Boyle selects the specific components, designs the failure modes, ensures the substitutions pass standard inspection. Whoever runs the Callaway credentials maintains the paper trail and points it at the intake technician when things start to unravel. Vivienne picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. I hired these people, she said. Not self-pitying, just a statement of fact that she was clearly making herself sit with. I approved their positions. I trusted their work. I didn't... She stopped. You couldn't have known, Rowan said. That's not particularly comforting. I know. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm saying it because it's accurate. He looked at her. What matters now is what you do with the next 48 hours before whoever's running this realizes the investigation isn't going the way they planned. Vivian looked at him across the table for a moment. You're very calm for someone whose life they just tried to ruin. Being calm is how I figure things out, he said. I can be something else later. Something shifted in her face again. That almost smile that appeared briefly and then resolved back into focus. All right, the fleet records are accessible from my personal executive portal. I can give you a guest credential. You won't be visible in the system access logs under your own name. What name will I be under? Mine, she said. I'll be accessing my own system. You'll just be the one looking at it. That's not technically invisible. No, she said. But it puts me in the record alongside you, which means if this comes apart, I go with it. That's the point. She looked at him directly. I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to take any more risk than I'm taking myself. Rowan studied her face for a moment. He was good at reading faces. Not because he was particularly perceptive about people generally, but because 11 years of working in a technical environment where miscommunication had physical consequences had taught him to look for the gap between what people said and what their face was doing when they said it. Vivian Sterling's face, when she said that, was doing exactly what her words were doing. No gap. All right, he said. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. On it was a guest credential, handwritten with a login address and a temporary password. The technical procurement records are in the supply chain module, subfolder ASC3. The material certification archive is under a separate filing system labeled MCERT. Cross-referencing them will take time. I know what I'm looking for, he said. She nodded. One more thing. She paused. The board meeting is Friday, 2 days from now. The shareholder vote on the technology division sale is on the agenda. If we don't have something concrete before that meeting, something I can put in front of the board that explains what's actually been happening, Marsh will use the meeting to push the sale through. The counterfeit incident becomes evidence of operational failure on my watch. The board panics. The vote goes through at Hargrove's terms. And the counterfeit parts investigation gets resolved quietly. Rowan Cross, negligent intake technician, accepts a settlement and signs an NDA. The fleet issue gets addressed at minimum necessary scale. And Hargrove Capital Partners acquires the technology division for $620 million and resells it within 18 months for somewhere north of $2 billion. Rowan put the folded paper in his shirt pocket. Then we need to be done by Friday morning. Yes, said Vivian Sterling. We do. He left Hanratty's at 2:47 p.m. and drove home. He picked up Lily from school at the normal time and made dinner. Leftovers tonight, not pasta, a soup he'd frozen 2 weeks ago that was better the second time around, which was true of most things if you were patient enough. Lily told him about an argument that had happened at recess involving a disputed rule in a game whose rules she explained at length without ever quite making clear what the game actually was. He listened to all of it. He waited until she was asleep before he opened his laptop and logged in with the credential on the folded piece of paper. The supply chain records of Sterling Aerospace Holdings loaded onto his screen at 9:48 p.m., and Rowan Cross began reading them the way he read everything, slowly, completely, looking for the thing that shouldn't be there. Within the first 20 minutes, he found 2 more ghost vendor authorizations he hadn't seen in the public filings. Authorizations that had been routed through a secondary approval channel, a channel labeled in the system as Emergency Procurement Protocol, designed for urgent part replacements that couldn't wait for standard authorization cycles. The emergency protocol existed for legitimate reasons. Aircraft grounded unexpectedly, parts needed fast. The standard 3-day approval window was too slow. Legitimate, necessary, and he could see it now with the completeness of the internal records in front of him, used 23 times in the last 14 months, 16 of which traced back to the same cluster of ghost vendors. 16 emergency procurements, components distributed across 11 different aircraft in the fleet, and a materials certification archive in the MCert subfolder that showed every single one of them had been signed off by a quality inspector whose credentials, when he looked them up in the employee directory Vivian had given him access to, corresponded to a staff member who had left the company 8 months ago. Authorization signed by a ghost name. Co-signed by a credential tied to Curtis Boyle. Certified by an employee who no longer worked there. The architecture of it was actually impressive, in the way that a very well-constructed lie was sometimes impressive. The attention to detail, the redundancy of the false trails, the depth of the planning. Someone had spent a serious amount of time building this. Not a quick scheme, not opportunistic. Deliberate and patient and thorough. He documented everything, not screenshots. Screenshots could be questioned, could be claimed as edited. He built a log, timed and dated, with system record IDs and file path references that would allow an independent investigator to navigate directly to the source material. He wrote it in the same disciplined way he'd written maintenance reports for 11 years, because the habit of precision didn't care what kind of document it was being applied to. He worked until 2:30 in the morning. At some point around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Back off, Cross. You don't understand what you're in the middle of. Take the settlement and walk away while you still can. He looked at the text for a moment. Then he took a photograph of it, added it to his documentation log, and went back to the supply chain records. Whoever had sent that message had made a mistake. Not a big one, but a real one. They told him he was in the middle of something, which confirmed there was something to be in the middle of. They told him to walk away while he could, which meant they believed he was capable of finding what he was looking for. He found it useful to know they were paying attention. It meant he was looking in the right place. At 2:31 a.m., he found the first direct financial transfer, an outgoing payment from a Sterling Aerospace operational account, a subsidiary maintenance budget account that sat several layers below the main corporate treasury, to Vortex Component Supply. Cross-reference to a corresponding incoming payment from Vortex to a numbered account at a private bank in a jurisdiction whose name he recognized as a common destination for money that didn't want to be found. He cross-referenced the numbered account against the other ghost vendor payment records. The same account appeared in 7 of the 16 emergency procurement transactions. One account, receiving money from 7 ghost companies, all of them feeding into the same Sterling Aerospace operational budget channels. And the signatory authority on that operational account, the person who had the authority to authorize transfers at that budget level, was Elliot Marsh. Rowan sat back from his laptop. Outside his kitchen window, it was fully dark and very quiet. The neighborhood held in the particular stillness of 3 in the morning, when even the dogs were asleep. Lily's drawings on the refrigerator. The horse in the picture of their house, because he lived there too. He thought about Vivian Sterling, who would wake up in a few hours and have approximately 48 hours to prevent her company from being dismantled by people she'd trusted, using a scheme she hadn't known existed until yesterday morning when a maintenance technician in a half-lit hangar had noticed something on the floor that he didn't have a reason to explain away. He thought about what it would mean to have that kind of evidence, clean, sourced, documented, traceable, in front of a board before Friday's meeting. Then he closed the laptop, went to his room, and slept for 4 hours. It wasn't enough sleep, but it rarely was. The work had a shape now, and shapes, once visible, were harder to ignore than the dark they'd been hiding in. He sent Vivian a message at 6:15 in the morning, before Lily was awake, before the coffee had fully taken effect, because what he'd found the previous night had a weight to it that made waiting feel irresponsible. The message was short. 11 aircraft, 16 emergency procurements, 1 outgoing account. Marsh's signature authority. I have the record IDs. We need to talk today. Her response came back in 4 minutes, which told him she'd been awake for a while. Come to the office. Side entrance on Kellner Street, 7:30. Ask for Sandra at the reception desk and say you're there for the Meridian compliance review. He dropped Lily at school 20 minutes early, which required bribing her with the promise of pancakes on Saturday, a debt he wrote down on the notepad he kept on the counter because he'd learned early in fatherhood that children had perfect memory for promises and no mercy for fathers who forgot them. Then he drove to the Sterling Aerospace Holdings corporate offices, which were in a glass and steel building downtown that looked like money without trying too hard about it, found the side entrance on Kellner Street, and asked for Sandra. Sandra was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular unruffleable quality of someone who had worked for powerful people long enough to find almost nothing remarkable. She looked at him once, said, "Compliance review? Yes," and walked him through a service corridor to a private elevator that required a key card she produced from her blazer pocket. She pressed the button for the 14th floor and rode up with him in silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. "You're the mechanic," she said as the elevator slowed. "Yes." "Good," she said, in a tone that suggested she had opinions about the situation and had decided that was sufficient expression of them. The 14th floor was Vivian's executive suite, not the public-facing reception area with the logo on the wall, but the working floor, the one with the conference rooms and the private offices and the wall of windows that looked out over the city in the way that expensive office space always did, reminding you constantly of the altitude. Vivian was in a conference room with two other people Rowan didn't recognize, a woman who introduced herself as Nora Vass, the company's general counsel, and a man named Philip Dean, who Vivian said was her most trusted board member, and who looked at Rowan with the careful, neutral assessment of someone trying to decide in real time how much weight to give him. Dean was 60, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome 30 years ago and had aged into something more interesting. He wore no tie, which in a room like this felt deliberate. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he kept rolling between his fingers. "Ms. Sterling tells me you're the one who stopped the aircraft Tuesday morning," he said. "Yes," Rowan said, "and that you've been doing your own analysis of the supply chain records." "With access Ms. Sterling provided, yes." Dean looked at Vivian. "That's irregular." "Most of the last 48 hours has been irregular," Vivian said. She looked at Rowan. "Tell them what you found." Rowan put his legal pad on the table, the original one, handwritten, dated, with source references, and walked them through it. He didn't try to make it dramatic. He went in order, the way you walked through a diagnostic, starting with the physical evidence and building outward. The metallic particles, the bore scope finding, the materials analysis on the oil return tube, the public compliance filings with Callaway's signature on 7 ghost vendor approvals, the internal system records showing 16 emergency procurements routed through the same cluster of ghost companies, co-authorized by a credential traceable to Curtis Boyle, certified by an employee who no longer existed in the company. And then the financial transfers, the outgoing payments from a subsidiary maintenance budget account under Marsh's signatory authority, routed through Vortex and its associated shells to a numbered account at a private bank. He spoke for 22 minutes without interruption. When he finished, the room was quiet. Nora Vass was the first to speak. She was a precise, small-framed woman who had been taking notes on a separate legal pad throughout, and whose expression had shifted incrementally from skeptical to something more troubled as the presentation went on. "The financial transfers," she said. "You're certain the outgoing account falls under Marsh's signatory authority?" "The account code is listed in the internal budget structure. Marsh's executive authorization covers that budget tier. I can give you the file path and record ID." "That's not proof he personally authorized each transfer." "No," Rowan said. "It's proof he had the authority to, and that the transfers happened on his watch. Whether that becomes proof of direct authorization depends on what the transaction logs show at the second level, which I don't have access to." "I do," Vivian said quietly. Everyone looked at her. "I have executive access to the full financial transaction logs. I didn't check them last night because I didn't know to look for that specific account." She paused. "I'll check them this morning." Dean had stopped rolling the pen between his fingers. He was looking at the legal pad on the table. "How many aircraft did you say?" 11 confirmed with components from the Ghost vendor cluster, Rowan said. 16 emergency procurements distributed across them. There may be additional aircraft affected through the standard procurement channel. I'd need more time with the materials certification archive to cross-reference everything." "How much more time?" 3 or 4 hours if I have uninterrupted access." Dean looked at Vivian. "Give him uninterrupted access." Nora Vass put her pen down. "I need to raise something uncomfortable. Mr. Cross is currently under internal investigation for accepting counterfeit components. Everything he's found here, accessed through an executive credential, documented on a personal legal pad, produced by someone with a direct personal interest in the outcome of his own investigation, is going to be challenged aggressively by whoever these materials implicate. I know that, Rowan said. I'm not saying it to diminish your work. I'm saying it because if we walk into Friday's board meeting with this and it gets dismantled on evidentiary grounds, we lose the opportunity, and we don't get a second one. Then we need independent corroboration, Rowan said. The materials analysis on the oil return tube is already independent. That came from the university lab, you said. He looked at Vivian. Dr. Lena Marsh. No relation, Vivian said. Lena Marsh? Materials engineering? Caldwell University? She ran the initial analysis. She can run the full component set if we give her the parts. And for the financial records, Rowan said, once Ms. Sterling pulls the second-level transaction logs, those are native company records. They don't need me to corroborate them. They stand on their own. If they show what you think they show, Nora said. If they show what I think they show, Rowan agreed. Dean stood up. He was taller than Rowan had realized, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture mattered. The board meeting is Friday at 10 a.m. That's 38 hours from now. I want everything you have independently verified in my hands by 7 a.m. Friday. I will convene a preliminary board review at 8 before the public meeting, and we present the full picture. He looked at Vivian. Can you hold Marsh and Boyle at arm's length until then without alerting them? Marsh has a call with me scheduled for this afternoon, Vivian said. I'll keep it. I'll be normal. Can you be normal? She looked at him with an expression that was approximately the facial equivalent of a dry response. I've been managing people who underestimate me for 10 years, Philip. I think I can manage 2 more days. Dean almost smiled. Fair point. He picked up his legal pad. Mr. Cross, whatever you need for the next 38 hours, you have it. Vivian, make sure he has what he needs. He looked at Rowan directly for a moment, the same kind of direct look Vivian had given him in the hangar, the kind that was actually seen rather than performing attention. You've done good work here. I want you to know that's been noted. I'd rather it be useful than noted, Rowan said. Dean looked at him for a beat longer. Yes, he said. That's the right answer. And he left. Vivian set Rowan up in a small interior conference room on the 14th floor. No windows, which he didn't mind, a decent chair and a laptop already logged into the executive portal. Sandra appeared with coffee without being asked, which he appreciated. Nora Vass stopped in briefly to give him her direct line and to say, in a tone that was more collegial than he'd expected from her, the work you've done so far is solid. Keep doing it that way. Sources, record IDs, timestamps on everything. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I'm saying it because it needs to be said out loud. This is going to get uglier before it gets better. She wasn't wrong about that. He worked through the morning with the particular focused quality that came from knowing exactly what he was looking for and having the tools to find it. The materials certification archive was extensive, thousands of records covering hundreds of components across the entire fleet, and cross-referencing it against the emergency procurement list required the kind of patience that most people found exhausting and that Rowan found oddly settling because the work itself didn't lie. Data either matched or it didn't. Components either came from authorized suppliers or they didn't. The truth was in the records, waiting, and all you had to do was read carefully enough. By noon, he had a full accounting, 17 aircraft with components traceable to the Ghost vendor cluster. Not 11, 17. 6 additional aircraft he hadn't identified the previous night, all of them serviced through the standard procurement channel with Callaway authorizations that had been buried in the standard filing queue rather than the emergency protocol. 17 aircraft, across 3 of Sterling Aerospace's regional hubs, components distributed across oil system parts, hydraulic actuator seals, and, the one that made his stomach drop slightly, 2 turbine blade sets on a heavy-use charter aircraft that ran 6 flights a day. He pulled up the materials certification on the turbine blade set and read it twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. He was reading it correctly. The blades were certified against a spec from a legitimate manufacturer. The certification number was real. But the certification number had been issued for a different blade set, A set certified 4 years ago for a different aircraft at a different company, a set that had since been decommissioned and scrapped. The number had been lifted and reattached to a new certification document. If you didn't cross-reference the original issuance record, it looked perfect. If turbine blades failed at operating speed, what happened afterward was not survivable. He messaged Vivian at 12:17, found 6 more aircraft, also found a turbine blade certification issue that needs to be acted on today. Not Friday. Today. She was in his doorway 4 minutes later, which told him she'd been nearby. He showed her the blade certification. She read it standing up, and he watched her face as she read it. And her face did what controlled, composed faces did when they encountered something they genuinely hadn't prepared for. It went very still, and something moved behind the eyes that was too complex to categorize in a single word. "This aircraft is operating," she said. 6 flights a day. "It's on the ground right now?" He checked the operational schedule in the portal. "It lands at 2:15 and turns around for a 3:45 departure." She looked at her watch. It was 12:23. "I'm grounding that aircraft. You'll need a reason that doesn't tip off Marsh and Boyle. I'll cite the ongoing fleet inspection as a precautionary measure. 1 aircraft, precautionary ground stop, pending component verification." She already had her phone out. "That's defensible without revealing the full scope of what we have. It's also going to make Marsh nervous." "Good," she said. And there was something in her voice that had changed from the careful, calculating quality of the previous 2 days, something sharper and less managed, the sound of someone who had been patient for the right reasons and was now running low on patience for the wrong ones. She made the call standing in the doorway, and Rowan heard her deliver the ground stop order with complete professional composure, no indication of urgency, just a CEO's measured precautionary decision. She hung up and looked at him. "Done. The aircraft is grounded." "Okay," he said. 17 aircraft, she said, "and we have 36 hours. "Then I need to keep working," he said, "and you need to have your normal afternoon." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought she was going to say something. He could see her deciding against it, pulling back to the focused, forward-moving version of herself. "I have the transaction log access," she said. "I'll pull the second-level records for the account you identified this morning. I'll have them to you by 3. She came back at 2:48, not 3 o'clock, with a printed document that she set on the table in front of him without comment. He looked at the first page, then the second. Elliot Marsh's executive credentials appeared in the transaction authorization field on 11 of the 16 outgoing payments. Not all of them, which was careful, which was the move of someone who understood that a perfect pattern was itself suspicious. But 11 out of 16 was not ambiguity. 11 out of 16 was a trail. "His password," Rowan said. "He logged in himself?" "The system records IP addresses for executive-level authorizations. All 11 show the same IP address." Vivian sat down across from him. "An IP address that resolves to a private router registered at Marsh's home address." Rowan looked at the document. Then he looked at her. "You've been busy." "I had Nora run the IP resolution. She knows a forensic IT firm she uses for contract disputes." She paused. "We have him." "We have evidence that connects him," Rowan said. "There's a difference. He'll say his credentials were compromised. He'll say someone accessed his account remotely using his IP address through a security breach. Can he make that stick? I don't know. That's a legal question, but we have enough to put in front of the board Friday morning, and enough that any independent forensic investigator is going to find the rest. The question is whether the board will act on what we have before the vote." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Philip Dean will," she said. "The other 9 board members. Some of them will want to wait for a completed investigation. Some of them are going to be pressured by Hargrove before Friday morning. I don't know which way the ones in the middle go." "How many do you need?" "Simple majority for a procedural hold on the vote. 6 out of 11, including me." "You plus Dean is 2. How many others do you trust?" She thought about it with the kind of honest, unsentimental assessment that he'd come to recognize as characteristic of her. Not optimistic, not pessimistic. Just a person trying to see clearly. 2 more, probably. Possibly 3. The remaining 5 are the ones I'm not sure about. Then we need to make sure what we put in front of them Friday morning is undeniable enough that not acting on it is worse than acting on it. That's a high bar. We're not going to meet a lower one. At 4:30, his phone rang. It was a number he recognized this time. His former shift supervisor, Garrett Hale. He almost didn't answer for a different reason than the unknown number the previous night. Then he answered because Hale calling him directly was information regardless of what Hale said. Cross. Hale's voice was uncomfortable in the specific way it had been uncomfortable 2 mornings ago in the hangar, but more so now, more pressured. You need to come in and sign the suspension paperwork. HR says you haven't responded to their emails. I've been busy, Rowan said. They're saying if you don't come in by end of business tomorrow, they're moving forward with termination proceedings. Okay. A pause. That's it? Okay. What would you like me to say, Garrett? Another pause. Longer. Look, I know it looks bad, but it's better if you just come in and sign. Cooperate with the investigation. The legal guys are saying if you cooperate, the settlement terms are going to be... Garrett, Rowan said. Who told you to call me? Silence. Not HR, Rowan said. HR sends emails. They don't ask supervisors to make personal calls. He waited. Who told you to call me? The silence on the line had a different quality now. The quality of a man who knew he'd given something away and was calculating whether there was any way to take it back. I'm just passing along the message, Hale said finally. Sure, Rowan said. Message received. He hung up. He told Vivian about the call. She listened without expression. Then she said, They know something is moving. They don't know what, Rowan said, but they know the suspension pressure isn't working the way it was supposed to. Marsh will push harder now. What does pushing harder look like for someone like him? Vivian thought about that. He'll try to accelerate the board vote. Move it to tomorrow instead of Friday. Take away our prep time. She paused. Or he'll try to remove me from the equation entirely. Rowan looked at her. Remove you how? Emergency Board Authority. There's a provision in the Sterling Corporate Charter for the board to place the CEO in a temporary administrative hold during an ongoing internal investigation that materially involves the CEO's judgment or decisions. It's a nuclear option. It's never been used. But if Marsh has enough board members lined up, he could trigger it before Friday. Can he? He needs 7 of 11. He might have them. She said it flatly, without drama. He's been working this for 14 months. That's long enough to make a lot of quiet arrangements. Then we need to move faster than Friday morning. I know. Can Dean call a preliminary board session tonight? Emergency disclosure? She was already thinking about it. He could see her working it through. If I frame it as a safety disclosure, I found new information about fleet-wide component integrity that the board needs to be informed of immediately, independent of the scheduled Friday agenda. I can call an emergency safety briefing. That's within my authority as CEO without requiring board approval to convene. Safety over corporate governance, Rowan said. It's also true, she said. 17 aircraft with compromised components is a genuine safety emergency, not a strategic maneuver. Then call it tonight. She looked at her watch. It's almost 5. I can have people convened by 8 this evening if I start calling now. Do it, he said. She left the room to start making calls. Rowan went back to the laptop and spent the next 2 hours completing his documentation, organizing everything into a coherent narrative sequence, cross-referenced and source-labeled, that started with the metallic particles on the hangar floor and ended with Elliot Marsh's home IP address on 11 financial transfer authorizations. He wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't an accountant, and he wasn't going to pretend the document he was assembling was anything other than a technician's disciplined record of what the data showed. But it was complete, and it was sourced, and it was honest, and those 3 things were going to have to be enough. At 6:45, Vivian came back. She had the look of someone who had made 8 phone calls in 2 hours and had not liked everything she'd heard. 7 board members confirmed for 8 p.m., she said. Philip Dean is facilitating. Marsh was notified as a courtesy. He's COO. He'd normally be included in a safety briefing. He said he'd attend. She paused. He sounded perfectly normal, cooperative. He said he was glad I was taking the fleet safety issue seriously. Of course he did, Rowan said. Curtis Boyle declined. He said he had a prior commitment. That's interesting. Yes. She looked at him. You should present. Not me. You. The board needs to hear it from the person who actually found it. I'm under internal investigation. I know, which means presenting to the board is going to be uncomfortable. Marsh is going to use that the moment you open your mouth. She looked at him directly. Can you handle that? He thought about it honestly. Handling it meant standing in a room full of people with authority and money and institutional skepticism, while the man who had helped frame him sat at the same table and worked to dismantle everything Rowan said in real time. It meant being calm while someone tried to make him look guilty. It meant making the evidence speak louder than the narrative Marsh had spent 14 months constructing. Yes, he said. You don't have to sound certain. I'm not certain, he said, but yes is still the answer. Something in her expression shifted. Not the almost smile, something more straightforward than that. Okay, she said. I'm going to make 2 more calls. Be ready at 7:30. He called his sister from the small conference room because Lily needed to be picked up from the after-school program by 6, and he wasn't going to make that. And his sister Deb was the one person in his life he could call for this kind of favor without it being complicated. Again? Deb said, not unkindly. I know. I'll explain everything later. Is this the airplane thing? I saw something on the local news. It's the airplane thing. It's gotten bigger. Of course it has, Deb said, with the tone of a woman who had known her brother for 32 years and had arrived at a settled understanding of his relationship with simple situations. I'll get Lily. She can stay here tonight if you need. I'll try to get her by 10. Don't rush. She and Maisie will just stay up too late watching TV and eat too much popcorn. It'll be fine. Thanks, Deb. Yeah, she said. Go do the thing. He got to the Sterling Aerospace boardroom at 7:28. It was on the 15th floor above the executive suite, a room that looked the way boardrooms were supposed to look. Long table, good chairs, the city visible through floor-to-ceiling glass on the far wall, the accumulated gravity of a space where significant decisions had been made. 7 board members were already there when he walked in, along with Vivian and Philip Dean and Nora Vass. Elliot Marsh came in 2 minutes after Rowan, which Rowan suspected was deliberate, arriving after the technician, positioning himself as the senior person responding to whatever the technician was about to say. Marsh was 51, trim, with the controlled physical presentation of a man who understood that appearance was a form of communication. He had gray shot hair cut close, a suit that fit exactly right, and eyes that were friendly in the practiced way of people who had learned to make their eyes friendly, regardless of what the rest of them was doing. He looked at Rowan when he sat down and gave him a brief collegial nod, the nod of a senior person acknowledging a junior one, easy and unconcerned. Rowan looked back at him without expression. Dean opened the session with a brief framing. This was a safety disclosure meeting called under CEO authority, regarding new information about fleet-wide component integrity. Then he looked at Rowan and said, Mr. Cross? Rowan stood up. He presented for 31 minutes. Same disciplined sequence, physical evidence, supply chain records, financial transfers. He'd printed the key documents, the Callaway authorization logs, the emergency procurement records, the transaction printout with Marsh's credentials and IP address, and placed copies in front of each board member before he started so they had the source material in hand while he walked through it. Nobody interrupted him while he spoke. The board members looked at the documents as he referenced them. 2 of them took notes. One of them, a woman named Eleanor Chu, who sat at the far end of the table and who hadn't said a word since Rowan arrived, went very still about 10 minutes in and stayed very still for the remainder of the presentation. When he finished, Marsh spoke before anyone else could. Thank you, Mr. Cross. His tone was measured, generous even, the tone of a senior executive who was very comfortable with the situation he was in. I want to begin by saying that the fleet safety concerns Mr. Cross has raised are absolutely legitimate, and I'm glad they've been surfaced. The oil return tube failure mode is real, and it needs to be addressed. He looked around the table. What I want to contextualize for the board's benefit is the source of the supply chain analysis Mr. Cross has presented here. Please, said Dean. Mr. Cross is currently under an internal investigation for accepting counterfeit components from an unauthorized vendor, the very vendor cluster he's identified here tonight. He accessed the company's internal supply chain records using an executive credential that wasn't assigned to him, And the financial transfer documents he's showing you were accessed and interpreted by a man who, I want to be very clear about this, has a direct personal interest in shifting responsibility for this situation away from himself. Marsh's voice remained even, never accusatory, never raised. I'm not saying Mr. Cross is lying. I'm saying the board should understand that the analysis before you was produced by someone who is not a disinterested party. Neither are you, said Eleanor Chu from the end of the table. The room got quiet in a new way. Marsh looked at her with the same controlled, friendly expression. I'm sorry? Eleanor Chu was 63 years old and had been on the Sterling Aerospace Board for 9 years. She had the particular composure of someone who had been underestimated enough times to have stopped finding it interesting. She was looking at the transaction document in front of her, not at Marsh. Your home IP address appears in 11 of these transfer authorizations. You are not a disinterested party either, Mr. Marsh. My credentials may have been compromised. This is exactly the kind of credential spoofing situation that 11 times, she said, over 14 months, at your home IP address. She looked up from the document and at Marsh directly. That's not a compromised credential. That's a pattern. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. The first moment, Rowan thought, where the control had cost him something. Then he looked around the table with an expression that was recalibrating in real time, adjusting to a room that was reading differently than he'd expected. I want an independent forensic investigation before any conclusions are drawn from— We're not drawing conclusions, Dean said. His voice was quiet and very certain. We're suspending the Friday vote pending independent review, and we're grounding the fleet pending physical component inspection. That's what this meeting is for. He looked around the table. All in favor? 6 hands went up. Then a 7th. Then, after a moment, an 8th. Marsh didn't raise his hand, neither did 2 others, 2 board members who would have been the ones Vivian wasn't sure about. But 8 was enough. 8 was more than enough. Dean looked at Marsh. Elliot, I'm going to ask you to step out while we discuss the scope of the independent review. Marsh stood up. He looked around the table one more time with the eyes that had been trained to be friendly regardless of what was underneath them. He looked at Rowan last, and whatever was underneath the friendliness was visible for exactly 1 second before the training reasserted itself. I look forward to cooperating fully with any review, he said, and left the room. The door closed. Rowan sat back down. He hadn't realized until that moment that he'd been holding his shoulders at a specific tension for the last 31 minutes, and releasing it felt less like relief and more like a system returning to its resting state, normal, functional, no longer carrying load it wasn't designed to hold indefinitely. Vivian, across the table, was looking at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up at him. He gave her a small nod. Not triumphant, just, this part is done. She nodded back. From somewhere outside the boardroom windows, the city went about its business, lit and indifferent and continuous, the way cities were, the way the world was when specific people were having specific moments inside specific rooms that the world didn't know about and wouldn't for a while yet. The vote was suspended. The fleet was grounded. 8 hands had gone up, but Rowan also knew, sitting in that room with the documents in front of him and the city behind the glass, that a suspended vote was not a finished thing. An ordered investigation was not a completed one. Marsh had left the room cooperatively, which was exactly what a careful man did when the room wasn't going his way yet. Not because he was giving up, but because people like Marsh understood that rooms changed, and boards changed, and 14 months of careful construction didn't collapse in one evening just because 8 hands went up. There was still work to do. There was still the question of what was inside 17 aircraft sitting in hangars right now. And there was still, somewhere in the architecture of this thing, the person or persons who had actually built the Callaway credentials, who had physically sourced and delivered the counterfeit components, who had opened a bank account in Rowan's name and put $4,200 in it and put his home address on the registration. The engineer behind the failure modes, the hands that had actually touched the parts, Curtis Boyle, who had declined to attend tonight's meeting due to a prior commitment. Rowan thought about that prior commitment on the drive home. After picking up Lily from Deb's, after putting her in the back seat asleep almost before he'd made it out of Deb's driveway, after carrying her inside and putting her in bed with the minimum necessary adjustment of blanket and stuffed horse. He thought about it standing in the kitchen at 11:15 with a glass of water, Too tired for coffee. Not tired enough to sleep. Boyle had known tonight's meeting was happening. Vivian had notified him as COO's adjacent authority in the technical procurement division. He'd had hours to decide what his prior commitment was. What did a man do with hours when he knew the walls were closing? Rowan set down the glass, went to the laptop, and logged back into the executive portal. He went to the MCERT archive, the materials certification folder, and navigated to the administrative access log, which recorded every time someone had opened or modified a certification document. He filtered the log for activity in the last 12 hours. 47 certification records had been accessed and modified between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. that evening. The user credential on all 47 modifications was the same abbreviated systems credential he'd identified before, the one tied to Curtis Boyle's employee ID sequence. Not reading the records, modifying them. Rowan's hands stopped moving over the keyboard. He looked at the screen. Boyle had spent 5 hours editing certification records, not deleting them. The system didn't allow deletion without a supervisor co-authorization, but modifying them, changing supplier codes, adjusting lot numbers, overwriting the traceable details that connected specific components to specific ghost vendors. His prior commitment had been destroying the trail. Rowan looked at the timestamp on the first modification, 3:07 p.m., which was 40 minutes after Rowan had messaged Vivian about the turbine blade certification issue. 40 minutes after something had changed in the urgency of what was happening, in a way that someone watching the executive portal access logs might have noticed. Someone had been watching the portal, and that someone had spent 5 hours trying to erase what Rowan had spent 2 days finding. He sat very still for a moment. Then he checked whether the MCERT system retained version history, whether modifications overwrote the original or created a new version while preserving the old. It retained version history. Every modification created a new version and archived the previous one. It was a standard records integrity protocol required by aviation safety regulation. Boyle had spent 5 hours trying to destroy evidence in a system that was legally required to preserve it. Rowan saved the access log, documented the version history protocol, noted the timestamps and the credential, and added it to the record package he'd been building for 2 days. He was thorough about it, as thorough as he'd been about everything else, because thoroughness was the one thing he'd had from the beginning when he'd had nothing else. He sent Vivian and Nora Vass a message at 12:03 a.m. Boyle spent tonight modifying MCERT records. System retains version history. All originals preserved. You need to lock that archive tonight before he tries anything else. He closed the laptop and went to bed. He was not a man who found satisfaction in being right at the expense of everything else. Being right about the oil return tube meant an aircraft hadn't crashed. Being right about the supply chain meant 17 aircraft were on the ground tonight instead of in the air. Being right about Marsh and Boyle meant the board had 8 hands instead of Hargrove Capital Partners had a technology division at half price. But there was a specific, quiet feeling that came from the work being done honestly, from the legal pad, the source references, the timestamps, the discipline of showing your work. And that feeling was something he recognized from the best days of his former career, when he'd been solving problems that mattered and doing it in a way that would still be true tomorrow. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him. Down the hall, Lily slept with her horse under her arm, undisturbed and unconcerned, which was exactly how it was supposed to be. Vivian's response to his midnight message came at 12:47 a.m. Archive locked. Nora is handling. Try to sleep. He almost smiled at that last part. He wasn't sure she'd taken her own advice. The morning came the way mornings did after too little sleep, gray at the edges, requiring more effort than usual to fully inhabit. Rowan made Lily's lunch on autopilot, the same sandwich she always wanted with the crust cut the same way she always wanted them cut, and listened to her talk about a dream she'd had involving a horse that could also fly, which she described with the total narrative confidence of someone who found this completely plausible. "Where did the horse fly to?" he asked. "School," she said. "But the good kind of school, where you only learn horse stuff." "That sounds like a reasonable school." She looked at him with the specific assessment she sometimes deployed when she thought he wasn't paying full attention. "You have the tired face today. Not the trouble face. The tired face. The tired face is better than the trouble face." "Yeah," she said, apparently satisfied with this, and went back to her cereal. He dropped her at school and drove to the Sterling Aerospace building. It was Thursday morning, 23 hours before the original board meeting had been scheduled, and the atmosphere on the 14th floor was different than it had been the previous day. More people, more movement, a particular alertness in the way the staff moved through the corridors that came from an organization that had been told something serious was happening without being told exactly what. Nora Vass met him at the elevator. She looked like she hadn't slept, which she probably hadn't. "The MCERT archive is locked at the version state as of 11 p.m. last night," she said, walking with him toward the conference room. "IT pulled the access logs and confirmed Boyle's credential activity. We have 47 modification attempts, all of them creating new versions over originals that are now preserved and timestamped under the legal hold I placed at 12:30 this morning." She said this efficiently, the way she said everything, information delivered in the sequence that was most useful. "The forensic IT firm I use is on site this morning doing a full credential audit. They're looking at the Callaway access history, the Boyle credential activity, and the IP address pattern on the Marsh authorizations." "How long for their preliminary report?" "They said by noon. I pushed for 10. We'll see what we get." She stopped outside the conference room door. "There's something else." Elliot Marsh arrived at the building this morning at 7:15. Rowan looked at her. He came in, went to his office, and has been there since. His assistant says he's taking meetings normally, responding to emails normally." She paused. "His attorney also called our legal department at 8 this morning. He's retaining counsel, and he wants it on record that he will cooperate fully with any independent investigation. He's playing it straight." "He's playing something," Nora said. "I don't know if it's straight, but he hasn't run. He hasn't destroyed anything we can identify. And he's sitting in his office 40 feet from the CEO who is building a case against him." She looked at Rowan steadily. "That's either confidence or strategy, or both." "What does Vivian think?" "She thinks it's both. She also thinks—" Nora stopped, seemed to decide something. "You should talk to her directly. She's in her office." He found Vivian standing at her office window looking at the city in the way people stood at windows when they were thinking rather than looking. She heard him come in and turned around, and she looked tired in a way she hadn't looked the previous days. Not defeated, not uncertain, but the specific kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for a sustained period without being able to put it down. "Sit down," she said, and sat behind her desk, which was covered in printed documents and 3 coffee cups in varying states of abandonment. The organized precision he'd noticed the first time he'd seen her was still there, but the surface underneath it was showing. He sat. "Curtis Boyle resigned this morning," she said. "By email at 6:15 a.m. No explanation, no notice period, just a one-line resignation effective immediately." She looked at the papers on her desk. His company laptop, his company phone, and his access badge were left with building security at 6:08. 7 minutes before the resignation email. He was in and out of the building in under 10 minutes. "He knew the archive was locked," Rowan said. "He must have figured that out somewhere in the night. The resignation and the equipment return were probably already planned before he sent the email. The email was just the formality he felt he had to observe." "Where is he now?" "I don't know. That's the honest answer." She looked at him. "Nora has notified the relevant federal aviation authorities about the component situation. That notification creates a legal obligation for Boyle to cooperate with the investigation. He can't just disappear. But practically speaking, until there's a formal process in motion, I don't have the authority to prevent him from going wherever he wants to go." Rowan thought about this. Boyle leaving wasn't what he'd expected. Not because running was irrational, but because it was a different category of move than what he'd anticipated from someone careful enough to have spent 14 months building a supply chain fraud without detection. Careful people usually had an exit strategy that looked less like fleeing and more like managed retreat. Boyle's 6:15 email and 7-minute building appearance felt reactive, not planned. Something had scared him last night that hadn't scared him at the board meeting. Did anything happen after the board session? Rowan said. Between the end of the meeting and midnight? Vivian thought about it. Philip Dean called me at about 10:30. He told me he'd spoken to two of the board members who didn't raise their hands, Marcus Webb and Diane Sorrell, and that both of them were reconsidering their position in light of the Marsh Whoopee address evidence. He thought he could bring them to 7 or 8 votes by morning. Did he tell anyone else about that conversation? She went still. He might have called Marsh as a courtesy. He's a principled man, and principled men sometimes extend courtesies that aren't strategically wise. If Marsh knew the vote was moving to 7 or 8 against him, and he passed that to Boyle. Boyle understood the math had changed. She leaned back in her chair. Marsh is playing it calm because he thinks his attorney can manage this. Boyle doesn't have the same confidence in that approach. Or Boyle has more direct exposure than Marsh. What do you mean? Rowan looked at her steadily. Marsh is the money side. He authorized payments, he has the executive credential history, but his defense is credential compromise and plausible deniability. He can claim someone used his access without his knowledge, even if that claim is thin. The burden on the prosecution side is intent, and intent is hard. He paused. Boyle is different. Boyle physically selected counterfeit components, designed the failure modes, wrote false certifications, and spent last night trying to destroy the evidence. That's not administrative negligence. That's direct technical participation in something that could have killed people. Vivian was quiet. If I were Boyle, Rowan said, and I understood that distinction, and I knew the archive lock had preserved everything I'd tried to erase, I'd be scared in a way that Marsh isn't scared, because Marsh can afford good lawyers and a credible defense narrative. Boyle is the one with his hands on the parts. So where does he go? I don't know, but I'd look at whether he has any financial accounts that aren't company connected, and I'd look at it fast, because once the Federal Aviation Authority issues a formal cooperation order, it becomes a different legal situation. But that takes time, and time is what he's buying. Vivian picked up her phone and called Nora. The conversation was brief. When she hung up, she said, Nora's already on it. She's working with the forensic firm to pull any financial account information we can access through legitimate channels. She paused. She also said the FAA preliminary response came in. They're treating this as a Category 1 safety event. There will be federal investigators on site this afternoon. That was the right outcome, and Rowan recognized it as such. Not because it resolved everything, but because it moved the thing into a framework that was larger than what any individual could manage or manipulate. Federal investigators meant process and authority and documentation requirements that Marsh's attorney couldn't simply outmaneuver with a clever narrative. Good, he said. They'll want to talk to you, Vivian said. You're the originating witness on the physical evidence. I know. They're also going to look at your suspension status, the investigation into your parts intake. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment. I'm reinstating you this morning. Effective immediately, the suspension is lifted. The internal investigation into your parts intake is being referred to the FAA as part of the broader complaint, which means it leaves Meridian's internal jurisdiction. She paused. I also spoke to Human Resources about the bank account situation. We've prepared a formal letter to the financial institution involved, documenting that the account was opened fraudulently, using your personal information, and Nora's firm is handling the identity theft filing. Rowan sat with that for a moment. 2 days ago, he'd been a suspended employee under investigation for accepting bribes. The ground underneath that had shifted substantially, but hearing the official version of it stated clearly had a different quality than just knowing the shift had happened. Thank you, he said. You didn't do anything that required thanking, she said. You did your job, and then you did about 4 other people's jobs on top of it. Something crossed her face, something that wasn't quite the controlled CEO composure and wasn't quite the almost smile, something more direct than either. I made a decision when I was standing in that hangar Tuesday morning. I decided to listen to you instead of to the 3 certified inspection teams and my COO. I've been trying to figure out since then whether that was instinct or judgment or just luck. Which do you think? I think it was the way you talked about what you saw, she said. You weren't trying to convince me. You were just describing it. There's a specific quality to a person who's describing something real versus a person who's constructing something. And you were just describing it. She looked at him directly. I've spent 10 years in rooms full of people constructing things. It's a very different sound. He didn't have a simple response to that, so he didn't offer one. There's something we need to do today, she said, shifting back to the forward-looking mode that seemed to be her natural habitat when she was done with something personal. Before the federal investigators arrive, before the board reconvenes, before any of the institutional machinery kicks in, I want to physically inspect those 17 aircraft. Not documentation review, not reports from other inspection teams. She looked at him. I want you and me in those hangars, looking at what's actually there. That's not standard protocol. No, she said. But I'm the CEO and you're the best turbine diagnostic technician I've ever watched work, and I'd rather know what's in those machines from someone I trust than read it in a report from a team that went through the same institutional chain that missed this the first time. She paused. We have 3 of the 17 aircraft at the regional terminal 40 minutes from here. We can get to the others through the day. The federal team arrives at 3 p.m. That gives us about 5 hours. Then let's not spend more of it in this office. They drove to the terminal in Vivian's car, which was a practical dark SUV that surprised him slightly. He'd half expected something more demonstratively expensive. She drove herself, which also surprised him. He sat in the passenger seat with his documentation file and looked out the window at the suburban landscape transitioning from office corridors to industrial and then to the wide, flat approach of the regional airport. Can I ask you something? She said, without looking away from the road. Sure. The career change. You said you used to do turbine diagnostics. What happened? He'd known the question was coming. People asked it once they found out. Not out of intrusiveness exactly, but because the gap between what he was obviously capable of and what he'd been doing for 11 years had a shape that demanded explanation. My wife died, he said, when Lily was 2. Cardiac event. Sudden, no warning, no history. Maya was 28. He said it the way he'd learned to say it factually, with enough space around the words that the conversation didn't collapse under their weight. I was traveling constantly for the diagnostic work. Different facilities, different aircraft fleets, gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. After she died, that wasn't the life I wanted Lily to have. A father who wasn't there. Vivian was quiet for a moment. So you took the ground job? I took the ground job. Same airport, same industry, home every night. Took a significant pay cut and a significant credential downgrade. He looked out the window. I don't regret it. Not even now? Not even now. He paused. The work is the work. The engines don't care what your title is. She was quiet again, not the calculating silence, the other kind, the kind that meant she was sitting with what she'd heard rather than processing it into a next step. I don't have children, she said. I've been running this company since I was 26 after my father had a stroke. The things I've set aside to do that, she stopped. You don't have to explain it. I know, she said. I'm just aware that what you describe, choosing to be somewhere specific for someone specific, is not a small thing. Most people don't do it. Most people find a reason not to. Lily didn't give me a reason not to, he said simply. She was 2 years old and she'd just lost her mother. What else was I going to do? Vivian didn't answer that, and he didn't need her to. The regional terminal hangar had 3 aircraft parked in a row, already identified by Rowan's documentation as carrying components from the Ghost vendor cluster. The hangar chief, a man named Ortega, who'd worked the facility for 20 years, met them at the entrance with the slightly confused deference of a man who had been told the CEO was coming and hadn't been told why. Miss Sterling, he said, we weren't expecting... This is a direct inspection, Vivian said. I need your bore scope, your lighting rig, and Mr. Cross here to have full access to all 3 aircraft. We're looking at oil system components and hydraulic actuator assemblies. Ortega looked at Rowan, not with hostility, more with the assessment of one technical person evaluating another. You're the one who stopped N4417VS. Yes, Rowan said. Ortega nodded. A short, decisive movement. Borescopes on cart 3. I'll get it. They spent the next 3 hours working through the 3 aircraft with the focused, methodical quality that Rowan had brought to every inspection of his career, amplified now by the stakes and by the presence of someone who watched everything he did with the same careful attention she'd shown in the hangar Tuesday morning. Vivian didn't pretend to have his technical knowledge. She asked questions when she didn't understand something and didn't ask when she did, which was its own form of intelligence. She held the flashlight when he needed it. She wrote down part numbers when he called them out. She didn't get in the way. The first aircraft was clean, or close enough. One hydraulic actuator seal that Rowan flagged as potentially non-OEM, based on surface finish characteristics, but couldn't confirm without materials analysis. He documented it, noted the uncertainty honestly, and moved on. The second aircraft had 2 oil system components that bore scope examination confirmed as showing the same wall deformation characteristics as the tube in N4417VS. Different components, not oil return tubes, these were oil pressure relief valve bodies, but the same failure signature. Thermal deformation that would pass visual inspection and fail at operating temperature. He pulled them both and placed them in labeled evidence bags that Ortega produced without being asked. The third aircraft was where it got worse. He was working through the engine oil system with the borescope when he found it. Not a component failure mode, but something different. A pressure sensor mounted to the oil system monitoring circuit. The sensor itself looked fine, completely standard, correct fittings and correct cable routing. But when he looked at the cable connector with the borescope, the seal around the electrical connection was slightly wrong. Too uniform, too smooth, in the way that a replacement seal was sometimes too uniform when someone had gone in and redone it after the fact. "Hand me the multimeter," he said to Ortega. Ortega handed it over. Rowan connected the leads and ran a resistance check on the sensor circuit. The reading came back in the expected range. He ran it again, same reading. He looked at the sensor mount. He looked at the connector. He looked at the wire routing behind the connector, where it ran back along the engine casing into the monitoring system harness. "What is it?" Vivian said from behind his left shoulder. "The sensor is reading correctly," he said slowly, "but the wire routing goes somewhere I don't recognize." He traced the wire with his flashlight. It followed the standard harness for approximately 18 inches and then separated. A junction splice, neatly done, almost invisible against the engine casing insulation, branching a secondary wire off the main circuit. "That branch wire," Ortega said, looking over Rowan's shoulder. "Where does it go?" Rowan followed it with the flashlight. It ran 6 inches further along the casing and terminated at a small component the size of a matchbox, secured with a single bracket to the firewall behind the engine mount. The component had no markings he recognized. It had an electrical connector on one side and a second connector on the other that ran to, he traced it, the fuel control unit circuit. The three of them looked at it in silence for a moment. "That's not in any wiring diagram I've ever seen on this airframe," Ortega said. His voice had changed to register. "That's not a standard component." Rowan looked at the unmarked component. He looked at the fuel control unit connection. He looked at the oil pressure sensor wire that fed into the matchbox's input side. When oil pressure dropped below a critical threshold, when an oil system component failed and lubrication began to starve out, the oil pressure sensor would register that drop. Standard monitoring would alert the flight crew. Flight crew would initiate emergency procedures. Unless the monitoring circuit's output was being intercepted by something that modified the signal before it reached the cockpit, and unless that modified signal was simultaneously feeding an input to the fuel control unit. He thought about what input to the fuel control unit, time to an oil pressure drop event, would accomplish. He thought about it carefully and completely, the way he thought about diagnostic readings, following the logic to its physical conclusion. He stood up straight and looked at Vivian. Her face told him she'd gotten there at approximately the same moment he had, because she'd been following his eyes and the sequence of the wire routing, and she was not a person who missed things when she was paying attention. Someone put a device in this aircraft, he said, that would detect an oil pressure drop and automatically trigger a fuel control event, depending on what the fuel control event is programmed to do. The engine wouldn't just fail, she said. Her voice was very controlled. It would be commanded to fail. Yes. Ortega said something under his breath that Rowan chose not to repeat. This needs to be in federal hands before I touch anything else, Rowan said. I'm not pulling that component. I'm documenting it, photographing it, and leaving it in place for the forensic team. Agreed, Vivian said. She already had her phone out. She called Nora Vass. Move the federal team arrival up, right now whatever you can do, and call Philip Dean. A pause while Nora responded. Yes, it's that serious, possibly more serious. She hung up and looked at Rowan. They can be here in 90 minutes if we push. Then let's push. He spent the next 90 minutes photographing the device from every accessible angle, documenting the wire routing in the sequence he'd followed it, writing a detailed technical description of everything he observed without speculating beyond what the physical evidence showed. The speculation was implicit. Anyone who read the description would arrive at the same place. But his job was to document what he saw, not to be the one who said what it meant. That was for investigators with authority and forensic tools and the institutional weight to make the conclusion stick. The federal team arrived at 1:45 p.m. 3 people, 2 aviation safety inspectors, and a forensic specialist who carried her own equipment in a hard case and who looked at Rowan's documentation with the rapid, comprehensive attention of someone who spent her professional life reading this kind of record. Her name was Agent Carver. She was methodical and quiet and asked precise questions. You didn't touch the device, she confirmed. I touched the wire insulation here, he showed her in his photos, to see if the jacket felt standard or modified. It felt standard. I didn't remove anything from the engine bay after I identified the junction splice. And this is the original borescope capture? She looked at his phone photos. Yes. Time-stamped, unedited. She looked at him for a moment in a professional way. You have a background in turbine diagnostics. I did, yes. This level of documentation it's thorough. She said it without inflection, which he took as a compliment from someone who probably didn't give them casually. I've had practice. She went to work on the aircraft with her team, and Rowan stood back and let her, because this was the handoff he'd been building toward for 4 days. His job had been to find it and document it cleanly enough that it couldn't be denied or dismissed. He'd done that. What came next required authority he didn't have and didn't need to have. Vivian came to stand next to him while they watched the federal team work. She had her arms crossed, and she was watching the aircraft with an expression he'd come to recognize as her thinking face, present and absent at the same time, processing something at a depth that didn't show fully on the surface. Curtis Boyle built that device, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Someone who understands turbine monitoring circuits and fuel control systems built it. That's a very specific skill set. Curtis Boyle has that skill set. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. This wasn't just about framing a maintenance worker for counterfeit parts. This wasn't just about destroying the company's safety record to force a sale. She turned and looked at Rowan. They were going to bring an aircraft down, deliberately, on a schedule. If N4417VS had departed Tuesday morning, Rowan said carefully, and the oil return tube had failed at cruise altitude, and if there was a device in that aircraft similar to what we just found, it wouldn't have looked like an oil system failure, she said. It would have looked like a fuel control catastrophe, a different failure mode, harder to trace, harder to connect to the supply chain fraud, and harder to connect to a deliberate act. She turned back to the aircraft. Something had changed in her posture. Not collapsed. Vivian Sterling didn't collapse. But the thing she'd been carrying for the last 4 days had added weight, and she was standing under it differently. I need to make a decision, she said. He waited. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. Marsh is in his office. Boyle is gone. The federal team is here. She paused. I could let the federal investigation run its course. Pull the fleet, step back. Let the institutions handle it. But Hargrove Capital Partners has 2 board members, Marcus Webb and Diane Sorrell. who we still haven't fully brought over. If I step back and let the process run without making a definitive move before tomorrow's board session, there is still a version of this where the chaos and the scandal and the fleet grounding becomes evidence of leadership failure on my watch. And the vote goes through at Hargrove's terms, and the technology division gets sold, and this whole thing gets quietly absorbed into a legal settlement 2 years from now. And if you make a definitive move, I go into that boardroom tomorrow morning and I put everything we have in front of all 11 members simultaneously. Not just the safety evidence, the financial transfers, the Marsh IP records, the Boyle device, the full picture. I put Marsh in the room, I let him try to explain it, and I ask the board to make a decision in full view of the evidence rather than in fragments. That's a risk, Rowan said. Marsh will push back. He has an attorney now. I know. And he's had overnight to prepare a narrative. I know that too. And there might be things his attorney can legitimately challenge on evidentiary grounds that make the board uncertain enough to... Rowan, she said. He stopped. I know the risks, she said. I've been running this company for 10 years. I've sat in that boardroom in bad situations before. I know what happens when you give uncertain people time to be uncertain. She looked at him directly. What I'm asking you is whether you'll be in that room with me tomorrow morning. He looked at her. Not as an employee, she said. Not as the person who found the evidence. As the person who understands these machines better than anyone else in the building, who can answer technical questions in real time when Marsh's attorney tries to introduce doubt about the component analysis. She paused. You don't have to. You've already done more than anyone could have asked you to do. He thought about that honestly. He thought about the legal pad on his kitchen table, the timestamps, the source references, the discipline of showing his work. He thought about Lily at breakfast with her flying horse and her certainty that he had the tired face but not the trouble face. He thought about the device in the aircraft engine, the unmarked matchbox component with its carefully routed wires, and what it had been designed to do, and to whom, and why. What time does the board session start? He said. 7 a.m. for the preliminary, public session at 10. I'll be there at 6:30, he said, and I'll need a working projector and access to the borescope footage. Something shifted in her face. That directness again, unguarded for a moment before the composed forward focus reasserted itself. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Thank me after. He drove home at 5 in the afternoon, which was early enough to pick Lily up himself from the after-school program, which she seemed to regard as a mild miracle given the previous days. She talked the entire drive home about a project her class was doing involving cardboard and paint, the specifics of which he didn't fully follow, but the enthusiasm of which he found completely restorative in the way that only a 7-year-old's enthusiasm about cardboard could be. He made dinner. Actual dinner this time. Not frozen soup, not pasta, but the chicken thing with the vegetables that took 40 minutes and was worth it. The recipe he'd figured out by mistake 2 years ago and had never written down and had to reconstruct from memory every time. It came out mostly right. Lily ate with her characteristic enthusiasm and told him he was a good cook, which wasn't objectively accurate but was something he appreciated hearing anyway. Dad? She said, with a piece of chicken on her fork and her mother's eyes looking at him across the table. Yeah. Are you done fixing things now? He thought about tomorrow morning, about the boardroom and Marsh and the federal investigation and the 17 aircraft in various hangars and the device that was now in federal evidence custody and the 47 modified MCERT records that had preserved their originals in version history, and the legal pad full of source references sitting on the counter behind him. Not quite, he said. Almost. She considered this. But you'll be here for dinner tomorrow? Yes, he said. I'll be here for dinner tomorrow. She seemed satisfied with that, in the absolute non-negotiable way that mattered most, not because she fully understood the stakes of what her father had been doing for the last 4 days, but because she understood the thing she needed to understand, which was that he had said yes, and he meant it. And in her experience, those two things reliably went together. He did the dishes. He put her to bed with the 2 stories and the blue cup and the specific arrangement of the animals. He sat on the edge of her bed in the low light for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went to the living room and sat with the legal pad on his lap and went through the entire sequence one more time. Not because he'd missed anything, but because tomorrow morning he was going to walk into a room full of powerful people and one attorney and present the truth clearly enough that it couldn't be taken apart. And he'd been doing his most important work in his life by doing exactly one thing, not having a reason to explain away what he saw. He wasn't going to start now. He went through the sequence completely, checked every source reference, every record ID, every timestamp. He found 2 places where his phrasing was imprecise and corrected them. He found 1 record ID he'd written down wrong, transposed 2 digits, and corrected that too. By 10 p.m., the legal pad was as good as he could make it. He put it on the kitchen counter next to his keys so he wouldn't forget it in the morning. Then he went to bed and closed his eyes and thought, for the first time in 4 days, not about the case, not about the engines, not about Marsh or Boyle or ghost vendors or numbered accounts. He thought about the sound of the aircraft hangar at 5:47 in the morning, the particular quality of the quiet before the work began, when the machines were still and the only sound was the distant hum of the airport and the particular metallic smell of turbine exhaust in old concrete. He thought about finding something true in that space, and what it felt like to not look away from it. He thought about that until he was asleep, and when he woke at 5:15 the next morning, the legal pad was on the counter, and the coffee was ready to make, and the city outside was still dark. And whatever was going to happen in that boardroom was going to happen with him fully present for it. That was all he'd ever been able to offer. It had turned out to be enough before. He had reasonable cause to believe it would be enough again. He arrived at the Sterling Aerospace Building at 6:28 in the morning, 2 minutes before he'd said he would. With the legal pad under his arm and coffee he'd bought from a drive-thru because the coffee at home had tasted wrong in the particular way that coffee tasted wrong when your nerves were doing something your face wasn't showing. The city was still in its early morning state, that specific hour when the light was coming but hadn't fully committed, when the streets had the sparse, purposeful quality of people who had somewhere to be, rather than people wandering toward their day. Sandra was already at the side entrance on Kellner Street, which told him Vivian had been here longer. 14th floor, Sandra said, and handed him a visitor credential on a lanyard without being asked. She looked at him with the same unruffleable quality as before, and then she said, "For what it's worth, I've worked for this company for 19 years. I'd like it to still be here in 20. She said it plainly, without drama, and then she held the elevator door. He found Vivian in the conference room with Philip Dean, Nora Vass, and Agent Carver from the federal team, who had apparently been there since 5:30. The table was covered in documents, printed, organized, flagged with color tabs in a system that Nora had clearly designed, and that Rowan recognized as the formal evidentiary presentation package being assembled from the materials he'd produced over the last 4 days, supplemented now by the forensic IT firm's overnight report and Agent Carver's preliminary findings on the device recovered from Aircraft 3. Vivian looked at him when he walked in. She was composed and she was tired, and she had the particular quality of someone who had made their decision and was living past the making of it into the execution. "You're early," she said. "You said 6:30. "I said 6:30. You're 2 minutes early." "I bought bad coffee," he said. "I had extra time." Something in the room relaxed fractionally, which he suspected was the point, even if he hadn't entirely planned it. Agent Carver looked up from her papers. "Mr. Cross, I want to brief you on the device findings before the board session." He sat down. She walked him through it with the same precise efficiency she'd shown the previous afternoon. The unmarked component from Aircraft 3 had been removed, examined, and identified overnight. It was a custom-built signal intercept and relay unit, not commercially available, not from any registered manufacturer, built from components that were individually legal and collectively assembled into something that was not. It intercepted the oil pressure sensor output, compared it against a hard-coded threshold, and when that threshold was crossed, when oil pressure dropped below the point consistent with bearing lubrication failure, it sent a timed signal to the fuel control unit that would initiate a fuel enrichment surge, followed by an automatic cutoff sequence. The result of that sequence, at cruise altitude, would be an engine failure that presented to the flight crew as a fuel control malfunction rather than an oil system failure. The investigation would look at the fuel system. The supply chain fraud in the oil components would not be the first thing investigators connected to the crash. "How many aircraft had the device?" Rowan asked. "We found units in 3 aircraft overnight," Carver said. "All 3 at the regional terminal facility. We're inspecting the remaining 14 today." "The regional terminal aircraft are the high-utilization ones," Rowan said. 6 flights a day. They would have reached the oil system failure threshold faster than the lower utilization fleet. "That's our read as well," Carver said. The devices were placed where the timeline was shortest. Whoever designed this had a specific window in mind. The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that. "The board session starts in 40 minutes, Dean said. He looked around the table. "Elliot Marsh has confirmed he'll attend with his attorney. The attorney's name is Richard Foy. I know him. He's competent and he'll be aggressive. He's going to challenge the provenance of everything we present." He looked at Rowan. "Which means your testimony on the physical evidence needs to be airtight." "It is," Nora said before Rowan could answer. She said it with a certainty that came from having reviewed his documentation for the last 12 hours. The documentation sequence is clean, sources, timestamps, record IDs, all of it. He photographed evidence before touching it, logged access through legitimate executive credentials that Ms. Sterling provided with full authority to provide, and his technical conclusions are corroborated by independent materials analysis from Caldwell University and now by federal forensic findings. She looked at Rowan. "If Foy challenges you, answer precisely and don't elaborate beyond the question. You're not trying to win an argument. The evidence wins the argument." "I know," Rowan said. She almost smiled. "Yes, you do." The full board convened at 7 a.m. in the boardroom on the 15th floor. 11 members, plus Vivian as CEO, plus Marsh and his attorney Richard Foy, who arrived together at 6:58 and took seats at the far end of the table with the specific arrangement of people who had positioned themselves strategically rather than habitually. Foy was a compact man in his 50s, with the careful, slightly aggressive stillness of a litigator who had learned that the most effective version of intimidation was apparent calm. He set a leather portfolio on the table, opened it, and didn't look up when Rowan came in. Marsh looked at Rowan once, the same way he'd looked at him the previous evening. The practiced, friendly eyes, the collegial nod. Whatever was underneath that training was inaccessible from the outside, and Rowan had stopped trying to read it. It didn't matter what was underneath. What mattered was the evidence on the table. Agent Carver presented first, which had been Dean's decision and was the right one. Federal authority established first before anything else, before Rowan's testimony, before Vivian's statement, before Foy had a chance to frame the session as a corporate internal dispute rather than a federal safety event. Carver's presentation was 15 minutes, precise and factual, covering the device findings and the materials analysis on the counterfeit components. She used language that left no interpretive room. The devices were deliberately installed, the components were fraudulently certified. The failure modes were engineered rather than accidental. Foy did not interrupt her. He wrote notes and did not interrupt her, which was itself a kind of answer. He'd been briefed enough to know that interrupting a federal agent's safety findings was the wrong move. Then Rowan presented. He stood at the end of the table with his legal pad and the projected bore scope footage on the screen behind him, and he went through it the way he'd gone through it every time. From the metallic particles on the hangar floor at 5:52 in the morning to the junction splice in Aircraft 3's engine bay. He went through it without performance, without drama, in the same tone he'd have used to walk a colleague through a maintenance finding, because the evidence didn't need performance, and performance would have given Foy something to work with. The board members followed his presentation with the documents Nora had placed in front of them. He could see them cross-referencing, looking at the photos, looking at the record IDs, looking at the financial transfer documents with the IP address notations. Eleanor Chu, at the end of the table, was making marks in the margins of her copy. Diane Sorrell, who had been one of the uncertain votes, was reading with a focus that hadn't been there the previous evening. Marcus Webb had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the bore scope footage with an expression Rowan couldn't fully categorize, but that wasn't dismissive. When he finished, Foy spoke. "Mr. Cross." His voice was precisely calibrated, not hostile, not deferential, the register of a professional engaging another professional. "You've presented an extensive record here. I want to ask you about its origins. He looked at his notes. You accessed Sterling Aerospace's internal supply chain records using an executive credential provided by Ms. Sterling. Is that correct? Yes. Ms. Sterling is the CEO of the company currently under investigation. She's the CEO of the company that was defrauded, Rowan said. Yes. A small pause. You were, at the time you accessed these records, under an active internal investigation for accepting counterfeit parts from an unauthorized vendor. I was. So you had a direct personal interest in finding evidence that shifted responsibility away from yourself. I had an interest in finding the truth, Rowan said, which is a different thing. Is it? Foy said pleasantly. From where the board sits, could they distinguish between a man finding the truth and a man constructing a narrative that serves his interests? They could look at the source records, Rowan said. Every document I've presented has a system record ID and a file path. Anyone with executive portal access can navigate to the original right now and compare it to what I've shown. If I'd constructed or modified anything, that would be visible in the version history, the same version history that preserved the records Mr. Boyle tried to overwrite. He paused. The integrity of the documents doesn't depend on trusting me. It depends on checking the sources. Foy moved on without acknowledging that, which was the move of someone who knew when an exchange hadn't gone their way. The financial transfer documents, the IP address recorded in the authorization logs. You've presented this as connecting Mr. Marsh to specific transactions, but IP addresses can be spoofed. Home networks can be accessed remotely. The presence of a home IP address in a transaction log is not proof that the person whose name is on that account personally authorized the transfer. No, Rowan agreed. It's not proof by itself. It's one element of a pattern. He looked at the board, not at Foy. The IP address is consistent across 11 transactions over 14 months. The vendor authorizations were co-signed by a credential traceable to Mr. Boyle's employee ID. The ghost vendor registrations match a window that aligns with Hargrove Capital Partners' acquisition push. Mr. Boyle resigned this morning after spending 5 hours attempting to modify the materials certification archive. Modifications that were preserved in full by the system's legal hold. He paused. Individually, each element has an alternative explanation. Together, they describe one thing. Foy turned a page in his portfolio. My client, Mr. Foy. Eleanor Chu's voice came from the end of the table. She hadn't spoken since the session began, and the room shifted when she did. She was 71 years old and had been on the Sterling Aerospace board since Vivian's father had run the company, and she spoke with the measured weight of someone who had been listening carefully for a long time and had arrived at a place where she was done listening. I've been on this board for 14 years. I've sat through quarterly reports and shareholder disputes, and 2 CEO transitions and 1 attempted hostile takeover in 2019 that I'm going to go to my grave believing your firm was involved in. She looked at Foy with the specific quality of a woman who had no remaining interest in being polite when directness was what the moment required. I've read every document on this table. I've looked at every photograph. I've watched that borescope footage 3 times. She looked at Marsh. Elliot, do you want to tell this board what Hargrove Capital Partners was going to pay you when the technology division sale went through? The room went absolutely still. Marsh's attorney put a hand on his arm, but Marsh didn't look at Foy. He looked at Eleanor Chu, and for the first time since Rowan had encountered him, in the boardroom the previous evening, in his practice nod that morning, the training slipped. Not completely, not dramatically, but the friendly eyes went flat, and in the flatness you could see the calculation that had been running behind them all along. My client won't be answering questions outside of a formal investigative context, Foy said. That's an answer, Dean said quietly. Marsh looked at Dean, and the calculation shifted again, and Rowan watched him make a decision. You could actually see it, the moment a man decided which version of the next few hours he was going to try to inhabit. I want to say something, Marsh said. Foy turned to him immediately. Elliot, I strongly advise, I want to say something. He said it without looking at his attorney, in a voice that had lost the smooth, managed quality it had carried for the last 2 days. Not broken exactly. Something more honest and because of that, more frightening. The transaction authorizations, why, I signed them. I'm not going to sit here and tell you my credentials were compromised. They weren't. He looked at the table. I believe the sale was the right outcome for this company. The technology division is worth more to a strategic buyer than it is sitting inside a company that can't scale it. I believe that, and I still believe that. And I believed that Hargrove's terms were going to improve once the acquisition was in motion. He looked up. I didn't know about the devices. I want to be very clear. I did not know about the devices in the aircraft. The room was quiet. You knew about the counterfeit components, Dean said. A beat. I knew the supply chain was being managed in a way that created operational pressure. I didn't ask for specific details about the component quality. He said this in the tone of a man who had been practicing a version of a statement and was now delivering the version he'd decided was safest. I didn't know aircraft were being made dangerous. You didn't ask, Eleanor Chu said. Marsh didn't answer that. You didn't ask, she said again, not louder, not harder, just with the settled certainty of a person who had decided this was the sentence that mattered and was going to let it stand in the room until it had done what it needed to do. 14 people on that manifest Tuesday morning. You didn't ask. Foy closed his portfolio. He would spend the next several months trying to convert I didn't ask into a defensible legal position, which was his job, and he would do it competently. But in the boardroom at 7:43 on a Friday morning, the portfolio closing was the sound of a case that had already been decided by the evidence rather than the argument. Dean called the vote at 7:51. Suspend the Friday shareholder vote pending full federal investigation and independent board review. 9 in favor, 0 opposed. Marsh abstaining because his attorney had finally convinced him to stop talking. Fleet-wide ground stop pending component inspection. Effective immediately, unanimous. Referral of all materials to federal aviation authorities and relevant law enforcement. Unanimous. Vivian made a statement that was brief and without the corporate hedging that statements like this usually contained. She stood at the head of the table and she said that what had happened in her company's supply chain was her responsibility to address, regardless of whether she had known about it, that the fleet would not return to service until every aircraft had been physically inspected by independent certified technicians, and that she intended to make the full findings of the investigation public rather than managing them through a legal settlement. She said this in 4 sentences and sat down, and there was a quality to the room afterward that Rowan associated with people who had heard something they hadn't expected to hear from someone in authority, a slightly surprised, recalibrated quiet. The session ended at 8:15. Marsh left with Foy without speaking to anyone. Rowan watched him go. The straight posture, the controlled walk, the practiced management of his own presentation even now, and felt something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite contempt, something more complicated and less clean than either. A man who had genuinely believed he was making a correct business decision had somewhere along the way stopped asking what the decision was actually connected to, and the thing it was connected to had included devices in engine bays and counterfeit parts in 17 aircraft and 14 names on a manifest. I didn't ask was not a defense, but it was in its way a true thing. And true things, even the damaging ones, were the only foundation anything real could be built on. Rowan knew that. It was the thing he'd known from the beginning, from the moment he'd crouched under a hangar floor at 5:52 in the morning and looked at a pattern of metallic particles, and decided he didn't have a reason to explain them away. You had to be willing to see what was actually there. Curtis Boyle was located 3 days later by federal investigators at a regional airport 2 states away, waiting for a connecting flight with a passport and a carry-on bag and $38,000 in a cashier's check that had been issued by a bank with no connection to any account in his name. He was detained without incident and later charged with multiple counts related to aviation safety fraud, evidence tampering, and the installation of unauthorized devices in certified aircraft. His cooperation with the federal investigation, which began slowly and expanded considerably once his attorney reviewed the preserved MCERT version history, eventually produced the full picture of how the device specifications had been designed, sourced, and installed, a picture that confirmed what Rowan had suspected, which was that Boyle had not acted alone on the technical side. 2 contract technicians who had been brought in through a staffing agency that existed for approximately the same 14-month window as the ghost vendors were identified, located, and charged. Richard Foy turned out to be as competent as Dean had assessed. Elliot Marsh's legal situation ran its course over the following year through a process that Rowan followed in the same detached, evidence-based way he followed everything. Reading the public filings, noting the factual developments, not investing in the outcome beyond caring that the outcome was accurate. Marsh eventually pleaded to 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of conspiracy, accepting a sentence that his attorney had negotiated down from what the initial charges would have produced. He did not go to trial, which meant the full scope of what he'd known, and when he'd known it remained somewhat ambiguous in the public record, which was probably the outcome his attorney had been aiming for from the morning he'd closed his portfolio in the boardroom. Rowan found he could live with that ambiguity, because the truth of what had happened lived in the federal investigation record and the board findings and the Aviation Safety Authority's published report, all of which were public and complete and would remain so. Ambiguity about one man's precise culpability was not the same as ambiguity about what had happened. What had happened was documented. The fleet inspection took 11 days. Of the 47 aircraft, 23 were cleared in the first pass. The remaining 24 required component replacement, ranging from oil system parts to hydraulic seals to, in the case of 6 aircraft, the removal and independent certification of turbine blade sets. 3 aircraft beyond the original 17 were found to have junction splice installations similar to the devices in the regional terminal aircraft, bringing the total to 6. All 6 devices were removed and entered into federal evidence. The aircraft returned to service on a rolling basis as each cleared independent inspection. The last aircraft was cleared and returned to service on a Tuesday morning, 43 days after the morning Rowan had stopped the first one from departing. He was not there for the return to service of the last aircraft, because by then he was working for Sterling Aerospace Holdings in a capacity that didn't require him to be in any single hangar. Vivienne had asked him, 6 weeks after the board session, whether he would consider leading a newly created independent aviation safety oversight function, a role that reported directly to the board, not to the COO or the supply chain department, or any operational structure that could be compromised by the same institutional pressures that had allowed 14 months of fraud to run undetected. The role was structured around the principles she'd articulated in the boardroom the morning of the vote. The people closest to the machines needed a direct voice in safety decisions that couldn't be filtered through administrative layers. Rowan had taken 4 days to answer, which Vivienne had accepted without pressure, because by then she knew enough about how he made decisions to understand that 4 days was not hesitation. It was thoroughness. He'd spent those 4 days thinking about Lily, about the promise he'd made when Maya died, about whether the role was one he could do honestly without sacrificing the thing he'd sacrificed his career once already to protect. The role was flexible by design. It required travel, but scheduled travel, nothing like the constant, unpredictable absence of his former diagnostic work. It required expertise, which he had. It required the specific quality of not having a reason to explain away what you saw, which was not something you could train into a person. Either they had it or they didn't. He had it. He'd had it long enough that he didn't think about it as a quality he possessed so much as a habit he'd maintained, the way you maintained a skill by using it honestly every time. He said yes on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table, with Lily asleep down the hall and the legal pad still on the counter because he hadn't gotten around to putting it away. He called Vivienne and told her, and she said simply, "Good," in the tone of someone crossing the last item off a list they'd been working on for some time. "One condition," he said. "Name it." "The inspection protocols go through me before they go to any certification team. Every time. Not as a review, as a co-authorization." "Done," she said, without hesitation. "And if I flag something and the operational schedule pushes back, the operational schedule loses," she said. "That's not a condition, Rowan. That's the founding principle of the whole function. I'm not building a safety oversight role that can be overridden by a departure time." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Is that it?" "That's it." She was quiet for a moment on her end. Then she said, "How's Lily?" The question surprised him slightly, the way her direct questions always had a quality of landing in unexpected places. "She's good," he said. "She drew a picture of a horse that also works at an airport. She says it does safety inspections." A genuine laugh. Not the professional kind, something less managed. Does the horse catch anything? She says it caught a bad bird once. I didn't ask for clarification. Smart, Vivian said. Some things are better left as stated. 3 months passed the way months passed when the work was real and the days had structure and the thing you were doing mattered in a traceable physical way. Rowan built the safety function from the ground up. The protocols, the documentation standards, the technician reporting channels that went directly to his office without passing through the operational management chain. He hired 2 people, a former FAA inspector named Watts, who had the institutional knowledge Rowan lacked, and a young engineer named Priya, who had the specific quality of asking why about things everyone else had accepted as fixed, which was the quality Rowan had decided was more valuable than almost any credential. He traveled when he had to. He came home when he said he would. He made dinner most nights, including the chicken thing, which he finally wrote down in a notebook so he'd stop having to reconstruct it from memory. Lily's after-school program had a pickup time he met reliably, which she had come to accept as the baseline of normal, which was exactly what he'd wanted it to become. He didn't think about himself as someone who had done something extraordinary. He knew people around him had begun to characterize it that way. The maintenance worker who stopped the jet, the technician who uncovered the conspiracy, the story that had made its way through the aviation community, and then beyond it in the way that stories about technical courage sometimes did. He read one account of it in an industry publication and found it mostly accurate and slightly too cinematic, which was probably unavoidable. He was not a cinematic person. He was a person who looked at engines and documented what he saw. The story wasn't really about heroism, as far as he could tell. Heroism implied a moment of exceptional decision, a threshold crossed, a dramatic choice made in a crucible. What had actually happened was simpler and harder than that. He'd looked at something. He'd seen what was there, and he declined to explain it away when explaining it away would have been easier. He'd done that repeatedly, over 4 days, in the face of institutional skepticism and personal jeopardy and a text message at midnight telling him to walk away. The decision wasn't one decision. It was 20 decisions, each of which was just, I'm going to keep looking, I'm going to keep documenting, I'm going to keep being specific about what the evidence actually shows. He didn't think that was heroism. He thought that was what competence looked like when it was being honest. He thought about that sometimes on the drives between facilities, on the flights to regional hubs where he was doing the first round of independent inspections under the new protocol. He thought about what it would have taken at any of those 20 decision points to look away. And it wasn't much, was the honest answer. A little more tiredness, a slightly lower tolerance for institutional conflict, a more developed ability to hear I know what I'm doing from someone with more authority and accept it as a substitute for actually knowing. A lot of people had that tolerance developed. Most systems depended on it, actually, on the majority of people, most of the time, accepting the institutional answer rather than the physical one. It was usually fine. Usually the institutional answer was close enough. But close enough and exactly right were different things, and the gap between them had a size that depended on the stakes. And in an aircraft engine at cruise altitude, the stakes were what they were. He thought about this on a morning in October, 3 months after the board session, standing in a hangar at a regional hub, watching his new inspector Priya run a borescope through an oil system on an aircraft that had just come in for its scheduled Type C. The aircraft was clean. Priya came back with a straightforward thumbs up, everything to spec, documentation solid. He signed the co-authorization, and the aircraft went on to the next stage of its inspection cycle. A clean aircraft, a correctly documented inspection, a safety function that existed because a CEO had decided to listen to a maintenance technician at 5:52 on a Tuesday morning rather than to 3 certified inspection teams and her COO. The world didn't usually reward that kind of listening. The world usually rewarded authority and credential and institutional confidence. Vivian Sterling had been taught the same thing by 10 years of running a company, and she'd overridden it in the moment it mattered, which said something about her that Rowan had been thinking about for 3 months without arriving at a clean formulation. He arrived at one, eventually, standing in that hangar while Priya finished her paperwork. It wasn't about instinct, and it wasn't about judgment, and it wasn't about luck, which were the 3 explanations Vivian had offered herself that morning at Hanratty's. It was simpler than all 3. She'd looked at a man describing what he saw, and she'd been able to tell the difference between description and construction, and she'd made the decision that the description deserved to be checked. That was it. The whole thing. He called her that evening from his truck in the facility parking lot before driving to the airport for his flight home. Not for a work reason. There was no work reason. He called because the thought had been sitting in his head all day, and he'd found over the last 3 months that thoughts like that were better said out loud to the person they concerned rather than stored indefinitely. She answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said. "Clean inspection. He paused, because saying it out loud required slightly more straightforwardness than he'd fully prepared for. "I've been thinking about why you listened to me that morning. In the hangar. A beat. And? I think you were able to tell the difference between a person describing something and a person constructing something," he said. "That's not common. I wanted you to know I think that about it." A silence, and in the silence he could feel her deciding whether to respond in the composed, forward-looking mode or in the more direct one. She chose the direct one. "I'd spent 6 hours that morning in a call with Marcus Webb about the Hargrove offer," she said. 6 hours of constructed arguments, beautifully structured, internally consistent, serving a predetermined conclusion. She paused. "And then I walked into a hangar, and a man with grease on his hands showed me his phone and said, 'I don't know what this is yet, but here's what I see.' I hadn't heard that in a while. Someone saying, 'I don't know yet.'" Another pause. "I think I just recognized it." Rowan sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Is that all you wanted to say?" "Yes," he said. "That's all." He could hear the almost smile in what came next. "Good. Now go home." He drove to the airport and flew home and landed at 7:40 p.m. and drove from the airport to the school where Lily's after-school program ran a Friday evening extended session for parents who needed it. And he was there at 7:58, and she was waiting by the door in her coat with her backpack on, and the particular expression of a child who was very ready to be done with Friday. "You're late," she said. "I'm 2 minutes early." She gave him the assessment look. "You have the tired face." "I've had the tired face for 3 months. I think it might just be my face now." She considered this seriously. "No," she said. "Your normal face is different. Your normal face doesn't look worried." "I'm not worried." "Then you should show your face that," she said, with the absolute logical confidence of a 7-year-old, and took his hand and started walking toward the car. He let her pull him along, the way she always did, with the total unself-conscious certainty that he was going to follow, and that following was exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He thought about the aircraft in the hangar. He thought about the legal pad on his kitchen counter. He thought about the version history that preserved the truth even when someone spent 5 hours trying to erase it. He thought about Eleanor Chu's voice saying, "You didn't ask," in a boardroom at 7:43 in the morning, while a man who had authorized 11 fraudulent transactions tried to find a safe place to put his eyes. He thought about all of it, and then he let it sit where it had always been. In the records, documented, time-stamped, specific, permanent, in the way that true things were permanent when someone had been careful enough to write them down. Lily was talking about her day. The narrative structure as impressionistic as always. 3 storylines happening simultaneously with no clear indication of which one was the main plot. He listened to all of it without trying to organize it, because the organizing was her job and the listening was his, and some arrangements of responsibility were correct not because they were efficient, but because they were true. They got in the car. He drove home through the October dark, through the neighborhood that had become home without him deciding it, past the airport whose lights were visible from the highway and the particular orange glow of a place that never fully slept. Lily talked. He listened. The heat was on because she was always cold, a fact about her that had been true since she was an infant and that he'd long since stopped expecting to change. He made dinner, the chicken thing, which he no longer had to reconstruct from memory because it was in the notebook now. She ate with characteristic enthusiasm and told him the horse in her drawing had been promoted. The horse was now in charge of the airport. She seemed to find this reasonable. "What does the horse do exactly?" he asked. "Makes sure the planes are safe," she said, "and also eats apples, but mostly the plane thing." "Good priorities," he said. She went to bed with the 2 stories and the blue cup and the animals arranged correctly, and he sat on the edge of her bed in the low light for a moment, and she was asleep before he stood up. He stood there a little longer than he needed to. The house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet late on a Friday. Settled, present, the kind of quiet that had texture rather than emptiness. Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, the notebook on the counter with the chicken recipe, the legal pad next to it that he was never going to throw away, though he couldn't have fully explained why, except that it was the record of a thing that had been true, and the record mattered the way records always mattered. Not for nostalgia, but because the truth needed somewhere to live after the moment passed. He stood in his kitchen at 9:15 on a Friday night and thought about an $80 million aircraft that had not taken off on a Tuesday morning, and about 14 people whose names he had never known, and about the fact that they were somewhere in the world tonight, doing whatever they did on Friday evenings, completely unaware of a pattern of metallic particles on a hangar floor, and a man with 4 days of coffee and a legal pad, and a decision made 20 times over to keep looking. He didn't need them to know. That wasn't why you did it. You did it because the engine was real, the failure mode was real, and the people on the manifest were real, and the only question that had ever mattered was whether you were going to be honest about what you saw. He'd been honest about it. That was what there was to know about Rowan Cross. Not the conspiracy he'd uncovered, or the career he'd rebuilt, or even the $80 million aircraft he'd stopped with both hands in the air in a half-lit hangar at dawn. Just that. When it mattered, when it was inconvenient, when 3 inspection teams and a COO and an institutional consensus said everything was fine, he had looked at what was actually there, and he had not looked away. He made sure the lights were off, checked on Lily one more time out of the habit that he'd had since she was an infant, and that he expected to have until she was old enough to find it embarrassing, and then he went to bed. Outside, the airport lit the dark and orange, steady and indifferent and continuous. The engines were quiet. That was enough.